So, Berto, Kanye West, new documentary. Let's talk about it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I teach people how to eat ice cream while meditating.
So, we did an episode on Kanye in 2019 because people were asking us to comment on his most recent behavior, thinking that he was crazy or...
That was before the presidency run and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was before arguably half of the drama that he's exhibited. And we detailed everything in that episode. And you can go back to listen to that because we detail his childhood, everything that we know about his development, about each incident with Taylor Swift and all the various different incidents up until that point. So I would listen to that. But at the time, there wasn't a lot of data about, quote unquote, what's wrong with him.
Right.
But now there's more data because of this documentary, which is called Genius on Netflix, in which you have 25 years of footage behind the scenes with a friend of his, Cootie, and Chike, who especially early on, had access to him before he was famous, really. And it gives us more information that we can now talk about regarding Kanye's development and personality. There's also been a lot more interviews since 2019 where he talks about bipolar and other kinds of things. I remember at the time of 2019, it was like, well, he might have bipolar, and he sort of referenced it kind of in his songs, but he hasn't come out and said. Since 2019, he's had full interviews where he's like, I have bipolar, I take medication, DDD. And another thing that I remember talking about in the 2019 episode was we had his public behavior. We did not have what's behind the scenes. And I remember saying, we'd have to ask Kim Kardashian, we'd have to ask his friends, what is he like behind the scenes? Because someone's public persona could be completely either fabricated in terms of an indication of one's personality or exaggerated or something, So with this documentary, we have a lot
more confirmation, yeah.
Yeah, not only of his early years, but even in the past couple of years.
And even before the documentary, we started seeing, statements from Kim Kardashian and others like, we just, he's going through some hard times. We just basically essentially saying in so many words, there's something not right with him.
Right. And I want to get into that because the public discourse, even after him talking about his bipolar, I find it to be interesting and reflective of not only the ignorance and lack of awareness in our society of various conditions, but also just our way of bending everything in a certain direction, which I'll get into later. But after seeing this, I thought I would just give my conceptualization, and you can interrupt me as I go here. This is me speculating and summarizing. So as I'm about to go through this, recognize that I'm not diagnosing from afar. I have only access to what we see in various different media productions. And if I were to talk with him, I would obviously get more information. But I think that it's useful on a number of levels. One is I think Kanye actually is trying to raise awareness for bipolar and other kinds of issues. So I think I want to assist him in that way by clarifying, I think, what he is actually trying to raise awareness for. Because I don't think it's actually, I think although it's raising awareness to some extent, I think people still have a very confused idea about even what they're looking at. Because bipolar is just so, particular. So I want to maybe even help his effort of raising awareness by providing a possible scenario or possible conceptualization of who he is.
Sure.
This is my conceptualization. It's a bit long because it involves everything, not just bipolar, obviously. The first thing I'll say is that Kanye West is a very normal person. He's a regular human being, and I suspected that earlier, but after seeing this documentary, even in the last couple years, he is extremely boring, normal, regular human being, He's a talented, famous, dynamic individual, but if he wasn't famous, I would just be like, okay, regular fella.
Like, as example, like if you were with Prince, you would be like, this is not a normal person.
Right, but I bet behind the scenes, Prince was, because, and I think this is another part of our mythology of famous people.
I mean, the people that spend time around him have some incredibly weird stories.
Who knows? Kanye is a very regular person, regular insecurities, regular foibles, regular interests, I suppose, regular behavior.
If I get your point, he's not going on crazy benders and disappearing randomly.
Well, whatever cartoon version human beings, the public, have of famous people is rarely true, perhaps with Prince, I don't know, but is definitely not true with Kanye. And this documentary shatters that for me. It shatters the cartoon, whatever you thought was going on behind the scenes, because if you look at his behavior in the interviews, or when he's yelling at some paparazzi, or when he's ranting on stage, you just think like, my God, what is it like in the green room or at home he must just be going crazy all the time. And you see all this footage of him. He's, and we'll get into occasionally, I think he does exhibit symptoms, but he's just like, he's having dinner and he's looking at YouTube. He almost seems like a business person, right? He's having meetings. He's like interested in this person's ceramic bowls, and he's thinking, okay, how can we kind of incorporate that into our next project? And he's coordinating things. Anyway, so I want to say that up front, that he's not from outer space the way that perhaps Prince is. He's just a regular dude in a hoodie. And if he wasn't famous, you just think he was just a guy next door, really. Mm-hmm. As with, I'm guessing, 99.9% of famous people. Okay, so the next thing is that he has some issues, which are quite mundane, quite normal, quite common, really. One is that he's insecure. And we saw this evidence previous to this documentary, right? Yeah. But what did you see in the documentary that showed he was insecure?
What's interesting is in the first part of it, I saw less, because I felt, well, actually, he seemed to handle rejection fairly constructively.
Right. He goes into Rockefeller Records and is just like, no one's really paying attention to him, and he just keeps going. And
there's that one time where he's showing a song, and he wants that guy, the Rockefeller guy, to listen to it, and he like leaves halfway through it.
Yeah.
And he's like, so I thought that. However, certainly in the third part, but there were hints for sure in the first and second part. There are moments where there is that chip. Like there's the salient moment when they were in a session. Someone had told him that Jay-Z's a genius.
Right.
And then he's like, well, I'm a genius or whatever. And he's like, no, listen. I thought you were a genius, maybe. But then I just watched Jay-Z come up with something. That guy's a genius. And Kanye is laughing. He's like, well, I'm not even laughing about you saying that. I'm just laughing about me feeling like, feeling disrespected by you,
No, well, okay, yeah. That was, I thought, one of the most telling moments in the whole documentary about who Kanye is. And you missed a part of it. I watched this scene a couple times because it was so interesting, and I was like, did I catch that right? And it's hard to know what's going on in Kanye's head, but you described it pretty well. But you left out a little section there where, he's talking with a bunch of people. There's, he knows he's being filmed, and it's sort of early career for him, I think, maybe like mid-fame, like right in the beginning of his first fame.
He's already helped Jay-Z or helping or working with him.
Right.
Yeah.
But Kanye has top 10 hits or top, number one hits at that point, I think.
Oh, he does?
Or maybe not.
No,
anyway.
I think it's before that.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah.
And he is talking with some other, colleagues in the rap field, if you will.
Right.
And he's saying, I'm a genius. He's always saying that. And then this friend of his who is seemingly not intimidated by Kanye, he's not an underling. He considers himself to be
he's just a buddy. He's like, come on, dude, you're no genius. I just saw Jay-Z. He's a genius.
And I thought you were amazing, but then I saw what Jay-Z did, and you're great. You're really talented, but Jay-Z is a genius. And then the part that you don't remember is Kanye starts to get upset. He starts to say something like, well, no, what do you? I just, I'm just about to blow. I'm gonna, you don't even seen what I'm gonna do. Yeah, like because he's always saying like, you don't even understand what's going on in my this giant brain of mine, and the guy's like, well, I I can't remember the word he said, but the way he said it, but the friend said, geniuses don't call themselves geniuses.
Right. It's for other people to call you a genius.
Yeah. And for you to call yourself a genius is, that's super arrogant.
Now,
Essentially.
I did take that. That moment's very funny for me because I can relate to a similar conversation I had with our friend Chong.
Well, before you go into that, let me just finish this. So then Kanye kind of senses the room is turning against him a little bit.
Right.
He's like, "Oh crap, I'm being called out by an equal. Normally I'm ranting to people who can't really call me out, and this guy's actually calling me out."
Yep.
And everyone seems to be kind of agreeing with him.
And I certainly can't put Jay-Z down.
Yeah. And I don't even think I can put this guy down because he's a talented guy himself, I think. And so so he turns and he's like, ha, 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 and you can.
That's what I'm saying.
You can tell he's totally uncomfortable and he's trying to mask something.
He's saying like, I just think it's. I'm not even saying. I don't think it's funny that. I think it's funny how I'm reacting.
Basically, what he said was, I was just joking.
Yeah.
That whole time when I was like ramping up my "I'm a genius" talk, I was just joking. I was just joking with you, and I'm like, no, you were not, Kanye. You were not just joking. And I thought that really exemplified what is going on underneath a lot of his behavior throughout his career. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, and just that moment of, look, I can totally empathize with Kanye in this moment. Because one, I actually think it's pointless and misinformed for a friend in that situation to make that comment. Because A, no one around you can recognize what you are or what you're capable of, because you're biased when you're around someone. This is the famous saying, prophet's not a prophet in their hometown, is from that, right? Like anyone who knows you, that grows up with you and stuff, they have put you in a certain kind of box. And so for you to say like, yeah, I'm going to be the biggest star in the world at some point, they're all going to be like, well, I mean, sure, but no. If we know you, and yeah, sure, you're good at your little rap thing, but come on, who are we kidding here? But in reality, they're wrong. They don't know. You don't know. And in fact, in this case, they didn't know, right? He ended up being the biggest star in the world. Now, that's part one. Part two is that I completely agree with you that Kanye was initially reacting in the most honest way and then tried to cover it up.
Right.
And that's why I called out. That to me was also indicative of a lot of the underlying situation.
Right. Yeah. Insecurity.
Yeah.
We don't rant about being a genius and being underappreciated and calling ourselves later in our lives a literal god if we aren't insecure deep down. That people who feel secure don't need to assert that they're smart or talented or good at what they do. They just wake up in the morning and feel good about it, and if other people don't recognize it, they're just like, well, it's fine. I know that I'm a good enough person that I don't need other people to see it for me to know it, then I'm okay. Whereas if you don't feel it deep down, if you deep down actually feel you're worthless or something, one of the defenses is to come out strong, constantly asserting and constantly either trying to bully people essentially into calling you a genius or pushing yourself harder and harder and harder so that people will think of you that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, which leads to narcissistic personality spectrum, which we talked about in the last episode, and I threw out various different possible data points, but it was really limited, and it was a lot of his on-stage behavior, which is just like, well, God knows what he's thinking. When he gets up on stage with Taylor Swift, or when he's at that other awards ceremony, and he's like, if I don't win this whole
it discredits the whole thing.
If I don't win this award, it discredits the whole thing.
Yeah.
And because at the time I'm thinking, well, yeah, that could be indicative of narcissistic personality. It could also just be strategic. It could also just be trolling. It could also just be trying to get into the papers.
Yeah.
Madonna makes a video with a black Jesus and has sex with him, not because she wants to have sex with Jesus, but because she knows that this is going to cause a controversy. She was already a controversial character, and she was at the pinnacle of her career, and she was like, I'm an MTV star. I'm going to create a video that's going to cause, I don't want to just be dancing around and prancing around. I want to come at this hard, And she did, and it was a whole thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of us assumed early on that Kanye was more calculating than that, right? Like it was like, oh, well, he knows what's up.
And I think that's still a part of it. And I think that's what's so interesting about the documentary for me anyway, was it's not a simple conceptualization, which, I'm going to go into here over time. It's like, on one hand, you could conceptualize him, at least a partial factor in his behavior was defensive narcissism, meaning that it's defending against a deep sense of insecurity and inferiority. But I also think he was smart and calculating. and also, it's also a part of the rap persona to be like, I'm the best. I mean, rap that has a 50-year tradition of constantly talking about you're the best in the world.
It is, and it's a fine edge because you can cut yourself with it. There was another very telling moment in the documentary, which is when his mother is telling him, this is very early on, remember, when a giant looks in a mirror, they don't see themselves. And Kanye didn't get it. He didn't get it at all. He didn't get the metaphor.
What do you think she was trying to say?
She was trying to say that, listen, I mean, okay, the physical reality of what she's saying, of the metaphor, is that a giant can't see their own reflection in a small mirror. But therefore, that to them, it reminds them that they're still nothing or, not that big of a deal. But others see the giant and see the giant, right? So what she was trying to remind Kanye of was like, it was the same thing that Pharrell tried to tell him, right? Which is, hey, listen, you're awesome, but just remember that you're still human, remember that you're still full of folly, and you could... He didn't get the metaphor. Yeah. Like in the whole scene, you would think that this was a movie, but it was reality. It was being filmed. And you could tell because he tried to like argue with her a little bit, and she's like, well, just remember that. And they showed that in the third part too again. And I was like, wow, he doesn't get it. And the mom must have said it for a reason.
Yeah.
She must have seen certain behaviors. And,
Right. So let's get to the mom, because the mom obviously would know him better than anyone.
Right.
For a variety of reasons. But in the little bits that we saw, she says, you come across as arrogant.
Yep.
She said that very easy. It seemed like something that wasn't a bomb in their relationship. It seemed like she says this frequently. Like, you come across as arrogant. And she also, at the same time, would pump him up and say, you are the best. You're the best. You're the most talented rapper of all time. The way a mom would, totally. Right? And yet, and we could talk about how, who knows if the frequent compliments began when they were quite young. Well, let me go down that road for a second. So I don't know. There wasn't any data along these. There was a little bit of data suggesting that the mom was perhaps overly complimentary to him, because, it wasn't strong, but there was a little bit of that where.
I definitely got that sense. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay. Oh, yeah. And I don't know, but if that was a strong pattern going back to his early childhood, and then from there, it's an overcompensation for abandonment from his father, because he talked about how his father abandoned him, or the divorce, or whatever, poverty. I worked with a lot of families who had this sort of circumstance, and sometimes I would see the single parent would just be spoiling the kid. And sometimes I would even say to families as they went through this transition that spoiling might even serve a purpose, but it has to come to an end at some point. Yeah. Say one of the parents dies, for example, and for the next couple weeks, the kid is, obviously in a lot of emotional, and they don't want to go to bed at 8:00.
Yeah.
They want to stay up to 9:30. Maybe it's okay to let them stay up to 9:30. You know what I mean? It's like, given the circumstances,
some slack.
Yeah, just a little bit of slack. You could go either way. You could say, well, it kind of sets a bad precedent. But we would understand that, but you don't want that to last for their entire childhood. That eventually you've got to come back to a balanced way of treating kids. And so did the mom do that because she felt bad for having set up a family life that wasn't as stable as she hoped for him?
That could be. So I could relate to a lot of things in this documentary about Kanye, which, by the way, parentheses. Oh man, I think I'm on your side. I think I'm going to stop reading YouTube comments. I think because, it used to be I would read a comment and it was like some dumb troll, and so I don't care. Those things doesn't bother me. But now I'm reading comments where people are just misunderstanding things. So
wait, what's happening? What's happening, Berto?
So there's the, what was the episode we did on?
Was it Cosby or something?
Cosby, yeah. Oh my God. Oh God. So first of all, people thought that I was basically defending him, because
defending him.
Yeah, I made this point about like we don't have to try to pretend like he wasn't famous and like he wasn't funny and like he wasn't a comedian and blah blah. And I think many of them stopped listening because they thought I was trying to defend him or something.
Wow.
And when I say many of them, like 2 people commented, right?
Okay.
But then there was another comment that was totally not addressed at anyone in particular, but it was like, you have to be careful when you ask a question to someone who is narcissistic. I have a friend like that because they might go off on a tangent and talk about themselves for a long time. And I was like,
And so let me nip that in the bud. I don't know if you're going to this place, but people out there, it's literally Berto's job to talk about himself and to go off on tangents, because I can do this episode by myself, but it is not dynamic. It's not conversational. It's not interesting. It's not fun for me, to tell you the truth. So Berto, sometimes, we'll say 1 out of 20, 1 out of 10 tops, goes down a tangent that makes no sense. But that's just going to happen. And so and now 99.9% of the listeners have, the ongoing listeners are okay with that because they've been self-selected. Yes. I'm guessing these are people that don't know you.
They don't know me, bro. Yeah. There was someone that said, what was it? Oh yeah, there's someone that said, Bruno's story was sort of interesting, but it was also kind of off topic or something like that. Bruno meaning Berto. They
called you Bruno?
Yeah, they called me. So then I replied, I thought we don't talk about Bruno.
Yeah, right.
But anyways, look. So the bottom line is,
you need to stop. So those comments aren't even that bad.
They're not that bad, but it's just
what emotional impact did it have?
Well, the one that actually got me was like people thinking that I was defending Cosby because I'm like, right, but
because that's a horrible. Right. If that was true, right, that would
like okay, well,
you're an evil human being.
Let's have a conversation. The thing is, I will say the value that I bring here, for better or for worse, is I tell shit that I've done that is stupid or learn lessons or trauma that I've had or whatever, and try to relate it to the topic when it's possible. Yeah. And that's it. So
and I know the vast majority of listeners enjoy that and appreciate that.
Right. So in my case, I was raised by a single parent as well. I mean, my mom left when I was young. And
so are you narcissistically going to make this about yourself?
Totally. I'm going down a rat hole. I am. So you know how Kanye is pretty good? I'm better. So.
Okay, Bruno. That's your new nickname.
My new nickname. So I was raised by my dad for most of my childhood, and he would always compliment me, always tell me how smart I was. And I was like, wow, it's so impressive.
You think he was doing that thing?
A, yes, but B, I think that was his way to positive encouragement,
okay,
positive feedback.
Because he was an early development psychiatrist.
Yeah, that's right. And he also tried to steer me, without my knowledge, steer me away from things like music, which he admitted later in the year, It's like, yeah, I tried to steer you away from music. I wanted you to be a scientist, But he would always be like, wow, can't believe how well you figured this out. You really pick all this up so quickly. Not like me. I mean, you're much smart, all these things. So I started really developing this narrative about myself that I was kind of really smart,
Better than other kids?
Certainly better than other kids. Wow. Better even than my father, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that was my narrative. But not at everything. At specific, like more brainy things.
I mean, it's one thing to have self-esteem. So tell me this, what age are you talking about right here? Like 7?
Anywhere between 7 to like 15.
Okay, so you're 13. You know that you're good at certain things.
Yeah.
Like the Radio Shack computer or something.
Yeah.
But do you think you're better than other people? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I think I did. I felt like I felt like at certain things I was better than other people.
Well, okay. So when I was 13, I was better than other people at a lot of sports.
Yeah.
I wasn't phenomenal, but I was better, you know. I don't know why. Talent, tried harder. My dad helped me. Who knows? But and some of the times, I just sort of registered that kind of like, oh, you know, I've you know, when I started wrestling, for example, I'd never wrestled before the 7th grade, and pretty quickly I was doing pretty well. And so it's just like, oh, you just kind of note it. You're like, huh, like that's interesting. That feels good, you know. But then other times I would assert it to others. You know, I am better than you at X, Y, and Z. Or I would try to make it known, you know, even to people who weren't on my team. It's like, yeah, yesterday, oh my God, so I hit a home run.
Right.
I had like 5 RBIs, which was the most that my coach has ever even heard of before. And like the third baseman, you know, Andy, he didn't even hit the ball. Like he just sucks. You know, like there's a difference between noting that you're better. It's a difference between Kanye knowing that he is very talented and able to create music that is cutting edge and interesting and, you know, perhaps quote unquote better than other people. It's another thing to constantly assert it. So when you're young, you're looking at yourself because you are a smart person. You probably possessed that high IQ when you were 13. It's one thing to look at that and go like, huh, I seem to pick up on stuff. But did you assert it and try to make other people feel small?
No, I never did that. And because there's another part of me, and I don't know where that one comes from, but it might be cultural, or I don't know. But I never liked to brag about anything. And even to this day, but I've worked on it over the years. For the longest time, if someone gave me a compliment, I would like try to dismiss it and brush it off.
Yeah.
Like, and then I started realizing how rude kind of that was, because I would notice that when I did it to someone and they reacted that way, I felt so deflated. Like, I just gave you a compliment and you're just like, oh, no. Like when you say, hey, let's say you just sing a song and I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. And you're like, oh, my voice sounded like crap. I was like, right? You know? So anyways, but back then, my dad would compliment me. So in my head, not to others, but in my head, I was always like, okay, I'm going to be special. I'm going to be really important because I'm so talented at something related to being smart. I don't know.
And this relates to Kanye. Like when you're watching the documentary,
I'm watching it. I'm like, okay, because when she told him, hey, you're arrogant. Well, I had situations as a kid and into my 20s, especially in college, where I would meet people and then I would hear from others that they had thought I was arrogant.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? I was always really puzzled by it. But it was a similar thing where I just gave this air of like superiority. Like I was trying to be superior to them. And I certainly wasn't trying to, but something was happening.
Right.
And I had a conversation with Chong, our friend Chong, one time at a bar where I don't know how we got into it, but I was telling him, listen, Chong, I'm going to do something really big one day. He's like, what? What are you talking about? No, I'm serious. Like Einstein level. And he's like, get the hell out of here.
This is like 20 years ago.
Yeah, I was in college. It was like, I was like 21 or something.
30 years ago.
Yeah.
25.
And he's like, yeah, get out of here. I'm like, no, I'm serious. And that, like, I remember specifically with Chong, I tried to make that point. But yeah, so when I was watching the documentary, I was looking at it going like, okay, so she is by herself with the kid and is praising him constantly. He develops this self-view of like, yeah, that's right.
Well, let me insert something in there while you're going through that. Yeah. Is that it's not just that, because if it was just that, then I don't think he develops into arrogance. You and him have, it's hard to know what he went through, but we know what you went through, which was complete abandonment by your mom when you were 4 years old, and continual reminders that you weren't good enough for your mom to actually pay attention to you, to reach out to you, that kind of thing. And also your dad having some deficits in his parenting. And then sometimes your dad abandoned you and left you with your aunt and your grandma and stuff.
Yeah, and through his life choices, essentially.
Right.
Leaving me out.
Early child, we're talking 0 to 7. Yeah. And so with Kanye, we could imagine something along those lines. The mom might have been great, but
it's not just, you're absolutely right. It's not just about the praising.
Right. It's like there are reasons to give someone the need to build a grandiose veil because deep down they actually believe they're inferior and not good enough.
That's right. And, of course, I never knew this, but it's true. There was this really deep-seated fear of, I must be sucky. I must be the worst person because who else abandons me, right? Why else would I get abandoned?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a profound trauma, and of course, it's not unknown to people, but I want to emphasize just how neurological it becomes.
Right. That
when we perceive abandonment, especially on that level where your mom just gave you an apple and walked out the door and you never saw her again for 2 years and barely saw her throughout your childhood.
Yeah.
That you could, the next day you're playing with Legos, the next day you're going to school, the next day you're laughing at Sesame Street. It looks normal, you know, but in your brain, things are changing.
Yeah.
Like connections are being made that are fundamental to one's personality of, I'm not good enough. And you might not be crying yourself to sleep. You might not be ruminating on it, but there's this clear, it's sort of like when we're 2-3 years old, we don't practice English. We don't sit there at 3 and go like, okay, it's I am and she was and she is. Like you don't walk, you just sort of absorb the language. It's the same when it comes to attachment. Totally. and working models of self and other. We just develop it from what happens to us. And so we could imagine for you and for Kanye, this deep, deep feeling of inferiority and not being good enough was developed.
That's right. And then coupled with then on the surface level, okay, well, this very important figure in my life, my father, in his case, his mother, is telling me the opposite. Is telling me that I'm actually the greatest. And then there's bits of evidence that show that maybe I am better than average on some fronts.
Well, right. So the way that I would say it is that for you and Kanye, there was this defense served up on a platter, because for a lot of people who are made to feel inferior, they don't develop narcissism. They develop other defensive structures, like they just wear their worthlessness on their sleeve, or they become depressed, or there's other avenues, or they become histrionic or something. But if one has been made available to them, so on a silver platter by your dad, by Donda, right? Of there is a way out of this inferiority, which is through showing other people that you're superior, not that you're good enough, but you're actually better than other people. Right. And for every Kanye, there are millions of others in his shoes who aren't talented in the way that he was. It just so happens that he also was talented in the right way and knew the right people, and because that was what I thought about after watching this, while I was watching the documentary, which is called Genius. And I thought, oh my goodness, if it weren't for him being in the right place at the right time and having the right talent, he would have just been one of those people that drinks himself to sleep every night and watches the news and rants a lot. You know what I mean?
And then you wonder at which point it would have been balanced out. Like, let's say he hadn't ever actually made it as a rap star, or he'd had some moderate success, but he'd had his success as a producer, and he ends up making a living as a musician in general, but just never to that level. I wonder if that helps or hurts him.
I know. Right. Because when you have that supply that happens where you start so other piece of evidence, just going through my notes here, is we hear from his mom and from him that early in his life, he was in every talent show he could possibly be in. Now, being in talent shows isn't necessarily evidence of narcissistic personality, but we add that to the constellation of things that we can see. We also hear that he would always win. You could say, well, he's really talented, but you could also say that he's so driven to be superior. And it's this concrete example. It's one thing to be good doing a lip sync and being charismatic on stage. It's another thing to win the contest, right? And if that is your primary source of self-esteem and self-worth, you might start working on your act months in advance, which is obviously going to give you a leg up on the other people. The other thing we hear is that when he would lose, he would get very, very upset, even if he just got second place. The other thing we hear is that he remembered details about his childhood talent show performances and about if he won or not. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Again, a very interesting thing happened. When I was with my dad, I started entering all these out of school contests. They weren't specifically school contests. They were out of school contests. I entered a national math contest, and I placed regionally and like went to the nationals and placed nationally. And the only reason I did is because I spent inordinate amounts of hours at home teaching myself math that we hadn't studied at school. And my dad sucks at math, so he couldn't even help me. So I was just like reading through books, hours and hours and hours, and practice.
What was the motivation to win?
Because I'm going to be the greatest.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And I remember the contest, and I remember the being there. I remember the feeling of sitting down, taking the thing. Okay. I also entered a computer contest, and I remember the qualifier because there were 3 pages you had to answer, but one of the pages was on the other side of the first one, and I didn't see it, so I only answered page 1 and 3. And on the way home, I heard from other students about some questions that I didn't see, and then I found out, oh shoot, I missed the whole thing. But then I must have answered so well all the other ones that I still made it to the finals.
Wow.
And then I got to the finals, and I remember the only reason I didn't get first place was because I didn't listen to my dad and didn't study my geometry, because you had to write a program using a geometry, blah, blah. Anyways, the point is I remember all these things.
Yeah.
And I was in those contests. But guess what happened when I moved up to live with my mom? I chilled the F out. I just kind of lived like a more
because you finally had your mom's attention. Yeah. Right. So the idea is that you're getting at is that if the fantasy was, if I can be better than other people at this, then I will finally get love and attunement and acceptance.
And I worked my ass off.
And then do you remember how you felt after you did well?
Yes, although I remember being very disappointed that I didn't get first place.
Right. It's this, and there could have been other kids who had similar issues in the contest, but there could have been other kids who were just like, yeah, if I win, whatever, I don't, it's interesting. But at the end of the day, I know my parents still love me.
Well, and there was another case where I had a science presentation to do for school. And this is 9th grade. So what do you think most kids do is they spend a couple hours on one weekend, put together some things. My dad, because it was on the 5 senses, and I turned it into like the 32 senses or whatever, because I was like all the ones that we don't talk about. My dad broke out all his university books. I was understanding about neurons and conductivity and everything. And I just like did a crazy deep dive for weeks, working my ass off. Did the presentation. I was doing poorly in this class. The teacher gave me an A+ for the whole semester and told my dad in a conference, and I didn't learn this till much later, that I had done a college level presentation. I was so happy about this because I had worked with my dad and I had done so well.
Right.
And I had bested the world.
So you fast forward to your 20s and you're talking with Chong about how you are going to be the next Einstein or Newton, because that's the orientation of the defense. If I can only be not only the best,
exactly, but
the best of all time, then maybe I will be acceptable and loved. And so being interested in math, being interested in talent shows, being talented is not an indication of narcissistic personality. But when we look at everything and all because it's all about where it comes from. A lot of times people on the internet will be like, well, Madonna obviously has narcissistic personality, and obviously Barack Obama has narcissistic personality. And when you hear their evidence, it's just like trying to get elected or trying to be number one in the pop charts. It's like, that's not an indication of narcissism. What's an indication of narcissism is why they're doing it. Yeah. If they're doing it because they just really love to create and they just want to be recognized, or it's just a personal goal of theirs or something, and their self-esteem deep down doesn't hinge on it, then it's not narcissism. But if everything hinges on it, if their entire mood, if their entire personhood, if they have a fantasy that this will finally make them good enough, then that's when it comes from narcissism.
What's interesting? I just made this weird connection that when I moved to live with my mom, I just said, hey, I chilled out, right? But that was only 3 years of high school. And then I moved out to go to college. And in college, I unchilled out again.
Oh, really?
So I never thought about that, but it's like I lost my mom again in a way.
Yeah. I mean, just because you grew up.
And I was only there for 3 years. You would think at that age, 3 years is kind of a lifetime.
Yeah.
But really, that was like my whole experience with my mom, was those 3 years.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, that is weird. So the mom says you come across as arrogant. The mom said Kanye was always self-absorbed. They talked about, I thought it was funny that Kanye won the talent show because he lip synced Stevie Wonder. I just called to say I love you.
Yes.
I mean, it's always funny to hear about essentially early career for some of these people, you know, like Jimi Hendrix playing 1950s like doo-wop stuff, or, you know, early 60s. And it's just interesting to, you know, to think Kanye lip syncing to the cheesiest Stevie Wonder song of all time. Yeah. The other thing we hear Kanye say, and it was hard to know if he was, tell me what you thought, if he was joking or not. He says, I raised myself, basically. He says that with his mom sitting right there. Do you remember when he said that?
Yeah, I do.
It sounded like he was kind of joking.
I think if she hadn't been in the room, there would be more of like, oh, but I feel like it was tongue-in-cheek, you know?
It'd be hard to imagine that there wasn't some truth to that.
Well, right, but it may be more in the sense, absolutely, but also I think there was a little bit of the, well, I basically raised myself, you know, like, oh, you were always busy or something.
Right.
Not so much as in really pointing the finger, although obviously that's the implication.
No, yeah. I mean, he didn't ever throughout the documentary in any account show any kind of outward anger towards the mom, but which actually raises another question, because everyone should be, particularly when you're a kid, angry at one's parents. If your kids aren't getting angry at you, that's a huge red flag.
Oh, well, then I'm doing well.
Because
my kids get angry a lot.
Because kids get angry. They're unbridled emotion.
Yep.
And there's a lot of things that you as a parent get in the way of your kids, and there's a lot of opportunities for them to get angry. If they're not getting angry at you, or if you have never been angry at your parent, that meant that there was some demand there that demanded that you not express it, which sometimes will happen to single parents, because, you know, you're like, well, you're the last resort, so I can't piss you off because then you'll leave me, and so I have to suppress my anger and maybe displace it to the label or something, you know. But anyway, but when people are neglected, which it sounds like maybe there was a red flag of him saying he raised himself. And I'm not saying his mom was a bad mom, but, you know, if she was a single mom, if, you know, who knows what was going on, then that can also lead to narcissism, because it gives the impression to the kid that they're not good enough, because they don't understand. If you explain to the kid, look, dad is gone and I'm alone and I have to work full time, and that means that you're going to have to spend a lot of time by yourself, latchkey kid, or you're going to have to go to the babysitters. And the kid might intellectually understand that, but again, neurologically, you develop this notion of, well, I'm just not good enough for someone to spend the time with me or prioritize me. And when you develop that inferiority, you have more reason to defensively become narcissistic.
You know, I as you're saying that, I remember definitely feeling like I never wanted to bring up to my dad things that I felt were not going well with him and like with the family and stuff, because it was like this kind of feeling like, well, I don't want to like upset him. I don't want to, you know.
Well, not only, I think possibly, given what I know about you and your dad, not only possibly the fear of abandonment by him again, but also he, you know, might have had occasional issues with listening, right?
Yeah.
So there were probably a number of reasons why as a kid you're just like, well, let's just not go to that place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's take a break, and we get back. Let's continue with this conceptualization. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
All right, back from the break. So we talked about him being a regular human being, which didn't surprise anyone. We talked about him being insecure and possibly on the narcissistic spectrum. I would say that based on what we saw, he was not, I would give him a mild case, mild to moderate. It was not severe. If it were severe, we would have seen a lot more alienation of other people. We would have seen a lot more anger from him. Because, one of the things that I was pleasantly, not surprised, but that I saw was that behind the scenes, he's a really nice, amicable, approachable,
totally
soft person.
Well, and it's obvious he couldn't have made it very far if he had been like an actual jerk or something like that.
Right.
Because like all the people that he would interact with, they'd still pick up his calls and they'd be like, "Hey man, how's it going?
Right.
Been worried about," like clearly. And so the Common, for example, he's like a stand-up dude.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have collaborated with Kanye if Kanye was just an ass.
Yeah, right. And just the little scenes you see him where, throughout his career, he just little scenes where he's talking with someone about working on this and that. And, he was just an extremely soft-spoken, again, very different from if you're just sort of aware of his public persona, you wouldn't imagine that would be him. But my impression was like behind the scenes, he was, like that one beef he gets into with that one other guy at Rockefeller, I believe, and he approaches him at the car.
Right.
And in so many other circumstances, we know that you have, Tupac.
Oh, totally.
And
that would have devolved very quickly.
Yeah, you have at least violence, potentially guns, and Kanye is just like, hey,
why you do me like that?
Yeah, it's essentially like, dude, you hurt my feelings. And then they go around the corner and they basically hug it out.
They hug it out.
And at no point is Kanye saying, let's throw down.
No.
He's not using any of that language of like, I'm going to call you out, get out of the car, let's say that to my face. Like there was no provocation. He was just like, ouch, that hurt my feelings. Why are you doing that to me? That's totally unfair. Like I was there helping you. Like, what are you saying that crap about me for? And the other guy was just kind of like, he didn't really have an excuse. He just basically rescinded the whole thing.
You could say even in the most egregious, aggressive, like not cool moments, like when he steals the mic from Taylor Swift and says, even then it's weird, right? Because he's not like, you don't deserve this. It's more like, I'm going to let you finish. But I just think she had a great record.
Yeah.
Now, granted, should he have done that? Of course not.
Yeah.
But even then, it's not like...
Well, and he's trying to pump up
Beyonce.
Beyonce. And honestly, he's never been more right. I mean, Beyonce's... put a ring on it video
I know.
is possibly the best video and best song video combo that's
he was
ever
saying
been.
What a lot of people were
Does
thinking.
anyone remember the song that
No.
Taylor Swift won that award for? I don't remember. I can't remember the title of that song.
So still wrong to do, but in the sense, if that's the word, the other example of him being on Oprah and being like, I am a genius, or like just bragging, but it's not. He's not like attacking other people.
Right.
Even when he's like, running for president or
you don't feel
backing
scared.
Trump. You don't feel scared.
Like
You're just like, well, he's a little odd, but he's not being angry and threatening and
right.
He
He seems, when he is more volatile, that of a child. Like if you look at him in that lens, it kind of gives the whole vibe sense to me.
Yeah.
Like, anyway, so the other aspect of his personality that I want to talk about is his nerdiness that I always detected, but never so much as when I saw this documentary. I mean, what did you see in terms of his nerdiness?
Well, so first of all, because the first time I ever heard of Kanye was when the video came out for Through the Wire. And as soon as I watched that video, I got that sense. I was like, oh, this guy's from my era. Like, I almost felt like he could have been my neighbor in Queens or something, and we would have both been watching cartoons on Saturday morning. And it's like, I got that feeling.
Right.
And then here...
Yeah, he didn't come... And it was really weird for the time because...
Right.
Especially when he started wearing, like, Izods and popping his collar and wearing, like, kind of goofy-looking sweaters and stuff. And... Because at the time, it was emerging from a world in which 98% of hip-hop artists were trying to fashion themselves as being super street, you know?
Yeah, totally.
And then this guy comes along and you're just like, oh, he's just kind of like a suburban nerd.
Well, and all his lyrics and his raps, at least early on, I haven't listened too much lately, but it was all very kind of like what a nerdy guy would sing, but in a great way.
Yeah.
I also thought because he's also a gearhead, you know, he's a producer and he's like into the this, and I'm going to use this thing here, and I'm going to
Right. So let me talk about that, because I haven't, I don't know if I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I think about this often, and I think it's why Seattle produces per capita a lot of musicians and other kind of artists, is because when you have nothing else to do and it's raining outside, then you just have to nerd out on something.
Might as well fiddle with knobs. You know?
Yeah, and to be a producer, to make beats,
right,
is that's why a lot of the rappers were like, give me some beats.
Right.
Those rappers could make their own beats, but it's tedious. Because you have to go, especially the way that the way that Kanye was doing, the way the fashion of the time was, you got to pour through literally millions of LPs. You've got to go through old, funk records from the 70s, and you got to search. And then when you find, and because I've done this work, when you find, especially back then, you had to excise it and catalog it. And then you'd have to, and so you might have thousands of little clips that you've acquired of drum tracks and choruses and stuff, and then you've got to name it all, and you've got to put it in different folders. Like, that's a nerd.
Oh, and these aren't, at the time when he started, he's like doing it in Akai machines and stuff. So, and he's writing shit down on paper too.
Yeah, it's not even like
it's an Excel spreadsheet.
Right. It's on these little machines. He's probably got like tons of cassette tapes with data on it and stuff, and so I thought, in this documentary, you can kind of see that, like, you could detect that behind the scenes, he's just sitting at home for 16 hours a day, just kind of going over how to use that equipment.
Well, you get the same sense from Pharrell Williams, who's another nerd, essentially.
Yeah. Well, he had a band called Nerd.
Right?
Yeah.
But he's like that.
Yeah.
And he was a producer.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of be a little bit like that.
Right. So, when you think about guys like Jay-Z or something, you just imagine he's the extrovert, he's the guy in the front, and he doesn't have time to sit down and make the beats. He doesn't want to learn how to figure out,
man, get me some of those beats, because I'm ready to rap.
Right. And so you see, and so not only that, just like producers are probably the nerds in the rap culture, but also the way he talks. And by nerd, I mean the class of nerd who is one really into something, like someone who's really into Dungeons and Dragons, or someone that's really into baseball cards.
Totally.
He's really into beats, you know what I mean?
Yeah, like DJ Jassy Jeff.
Right. and but not only that class of nerd, but also a little socially inept.
Right.
The way he comes across is like, everyone thinks of him as like, before he's famous, they're just like, yeah, I mean, that guy.
Yeah, that guy. I mean, he's neat and all. He's great beats, but I mean, come on.
Yeah, he's like emerging from the shadows, pushing his glasses up on his nose and going, hey guys, I got some beats. You just got that sense that he was loved, but not, it's not like you asked him like, where are the cool clubs at night?
People would humor him, but to a point.
Right.
And then only the people that really knew could tell talent on the rap side of things, be like, okay, actually, that's pretty good.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was. I mean, to this day, because as a songwriter and producer myself, I have spent time, not a lot, trying to make beats along these lines. And I can tell you that it is so hard, like, especially hip hop, to make a really like groove, that kind of, I mean, just 4 bars of just like slamming, just that you're just like, yes, that is a beat, and that's the way that the sample comes in there, and it's what nerds do. And I have known people that do that kind of work in my personal life, and I can attest to the fact that they sit in front of a computer for 16 hours a day.
Yeah.
Just pouring over little bits here, little bits here. Twisting a knob here, learning about different kinds of like how to get the best snare response. Like another nerd that comes across as a nerd is Tame Impala.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because I've watched a lot of interviews with him talking, and he'll nerd out on a snare sound for like 2 weeks. He'll hear like the perfect snare sound in some 70s song.
He's trying to recreate it.
And he's just like trying to recreate it. He's like, he's like, okay, yeah, I thought if I did this with the snare and with this, with this effect on it, and like if I hit it with maybe with a spoon instead of a drumstick, like, and like the Jay-Z's of the world, they don't do that.
Right.
They show up and in 5 minutes they come with, H to the is
it's
a.
Like, this is why we like Paul McCartney, because he had that thing too. He would sit there and he would want to try different sounds, and it was at a time where it was.
Well, he was
samples,
both.
But
he was both Kanye and Jay-Z.
Absolutely, but he had it right because he'd be like in the studio and he wanted to try all sorts of weird things, and it was at a time where they had to be all mechanical, right? They couldn't sample really.
But also, again, just to emphasize, I think that Kanye, part of his personality, which I think plays into some of his erratic behavior later on, is he doesn't, he's just kind of that nerd that doesn't really get how he gets how social, he's not completely hopeless, but
no,
there are times when it just looks like he's not reading the room well.
Yeah.
And, because another aspect that I kind of identify with is, as a young nerd, when I was, in middle school and whatnot, I would often find myself kind of spazzing out on something verbally, Yeah. And then later, and then realizing, oh, I've alienated everyone around me.
Oh, dude, I can relate to that a billion times.
Yeah. Whereas I had friends who were much smoother than me. So basically growing up, because I grew up in the same neighborhood my entire life, and so I was basically friends with everyone, and I was fairly extroverted, so I was friends with everyone, and so I was friends with the cool kids, but I was the nerd of the cool kids. And I was friends with what I would call the mid-level nerds, and I was the cool kid of the mid-level nerds, partially because I knew the cool kids. And then there were like the really low nerds who could barely put a sentence together. That was always the thing about them. It was just like they couldn't, like I'd walk, like, just a side note on that, is I go to my 10-year reunion and I'm thinking, let's put aside all of our who's popular, who wasn't.
No labels.
And plus I was organizing the reunion itself. And so I'm working the room. I'm going around to everyone, hey, how's it going? Just, da-da. And
pulling a Beardo.
I'm walking over to the cool kids. I'm walking over to little cliques, and I walk up to who were the super nerds, like the nerds that even my nerd group thought were nerds.
Right.
And I walked up to him and I was like, hey, how's it going? And da-da-da-da. And I'm in my head, I'm like, isn't it stupid that these guys were the nerds and the cool, like, we're all just people.
All just people.
Very quickly, I realized why these guys were the super nerds. It's because they could not, social anxiety or something, they could not reciprocate the conversation. It fell flat fast. And I remember going, all right, so I'll see you later. And I walked away going like, that's why they were the super nerds. But I think one of the reasons why I felt best with the mid-level nerds was because we were all spazzes about all sorts of stuff, about Dungeons and Dragons, about girls, about I don't know, He-Man or something. Like you'd just be like, oh my god, you sort of spaz out.
I had the same kind of group.
The cool kids never spazzed. Like they might have liked He-Man, but they didn't love He-Man. They might have liked Dungeons and Dragons, but they didn't talk about it all day long. We in the mid-level nerds, we couldn't help ourselves. It's like, can we play Dungeons and Dragons? Like that energy. I feel like that was what I saw when I was watching this documentary with Kanye. Totally. Like he just had this energy. Oh my god, that like 13-year-old that's just like, you gotta listen to this beat. Oh my god, I'm the best ever. You have to listen to this. It's so good. Whereas another guy would be like, yeah, whatever. You want to listen to it? That's cool.
Well, it's like when you watch Sting. I was just watching him play he did a video recently playing the Russians song because he actually said he hasn't played this song.
It's a great song.
It's a beautiful song, and he said I haven't played this song very much at all since the 80s
because it wasn't relevant. Yeah, you know, now it's relevant again. Yeah.
But anyways, when you think of Sting, he's like such a cool cat.
Yeah.
So you don't imagine him spazzing at all about anything.
Yeah.
So imagine him writing songs, be like, "Oh, that's a neat melody," you know, whatever. But
is that your British accent?
That's my British accent. Yeah. But yeah, I was in the same kind of clique. You know, we were those mid-tier nerds, and we had that same spazziness.
Right.
You know?
So I think that plays into Kanye's public mistakes that he would make, because I think sometimes, and we'll get to his bipolar later, obviously, but I think at times he was just kind of spazzing out. Yeah. He was just sort of nerding out, and he's just like, you know, we could change the world, you know, and I think that's another aspect of that would drive his behavior.
I also think there is a thing about media influencing our behavior, in that he grew up watching the same movies that I did and we did. And in those movies, that's the thing you do. You do get up and take the mic from the person and make a big spectacle in that scene in the movie.
Right.
And I think that there is for a certain kind of personality, you're like, oh, right, this is my moment to play out that scene in the movies.
Right. If I don't, I'm just another sheeple or something. Now, again, getting back to ground here is that overall, there's nothing extreme. He's just a regular guy, likable guy, creative guy, driven like you and me. He, you know, he's not incredibly nerdy.
Yeah.
He's not incredibly narcissistic. He's just, you know, just if he wasn't Kanye and super famous, he would just be like, again, like I said, the guy next door.
But you are right, though, that I had a very different perspective. Like, if we had been having this same conversation with you saying that before I saw this documentary, I probably would be disagreeing with you.
Right. Because we have a cartoon version of famous people that's based on not only what they do in front of cameras, but what the media decides to show us over and over again.
And when we start repeating, yes, exactly.
Yeah. And if you don't really dive into the full public persona of Kanye, there's like 10 clips that keep getting played over and over. The Taylor Swift thing, this award ceremony means nothing. The crying that my dad would have aborted me. You know, there's all these.
There are 10 clips of me that if someone had the footage and played them, I would be the worst human of history. You know?
So now he starts to get some fame and recognition through, you know, in his 20s, and it starts to feel good. It starts to fill that narcissistic supply of I'm good enough. I'm getting acceptance. People are saying nice things about me. You know, not only are people liking my beats, but I'm sort of accepted into the hip hop community, right?
Yeah.
And he becomes very obsessed with the next step up the ladder. Like, I need to get into Rockefeller Records. I need to release my album. I need them to, and all the while feeling like he's not getting, you know, a theme throughout his life is I'm the best. I'm reaching for the next rung of the ladder,
but I'm not getting recognition.
But no one's giving me recognition. Yeah. Like, after he has countless platinum records, he's still ranting about how he doesn't get recognition.
Absolutely.
So this points to a schema, a way of interpreting and distorting the world based on one's early childhood experience. So you can imagine he's 5 years old and he's already started to adopt a narcissistic defense against the feelings of inferiority and worthlessness, while always chasing him is this notion of being unfairly rejected.
Yeah.
And for reasons that are totally unfair, you know, which was real when he was 5, not so real when he's 35. Yeah. You know what I mean? And to some extent self-imposed, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so he starts to get some fame and recognition in his early 20s. But soon it isn't enough, right? It's like he's always got to get higher up on the thing.
But by the way, even because it's easy in retrospect to say like, wow, those Rockefeller guys, really, I can't believe they weren't listening to me. But it's like rappers are trying to make it all the time. Like, people are coming from left and right, like, listen to my record. I'm the greatest of all time.
Yeah. The other thing is that now as you're watching this documentary, you're like, but Kanye is the best of all time. So you aren't listening to him. Like, why aren't you giving him he is the best. But the thing is for every Kanye, like I said, there's thousands of others who are also saying I'm the best of all time. And half of them probably believe it the way Kanye does. And they aren't the best of all time. So it just so happens. And that's why, like, when you see a figure like Michael Jordan or Kanye or other people that do this, you're like, well, they saw it and they chased the vision and they just manifested their reality. And it's just like, but that's because they lucked out and actually grabbed the golden ring.
And that's the story we watched, but we didn't watch all the others.
You don't watch the thousands of others who never make it. And like I said, you know, beat their spouse or drink themselves, you know, to sleep every night because they're depressed because, you know, they're never getting any recognition. You know? Anyway, so, you know, part of this I can relate to, if I might narcissistically make about myself, is with this podcast was and it wasn't, I wasn't like Kanye, but and I would sometimes say it out loud though a bit, was that I always thought that this podcast could be quote unquote big.
Yeah.
A big podcast is like a little YouTube channel, but I always thought that what we were doing, especially once we kind of started refining it about 4 years in, I thought this is better than a lot of the other because I listen to a lot of podcasts. And I was frequently, actually, so this is very Kanye of me, I would periodically check to see where I ranked on Apple Podcasts among psychology podcasts. So you can search for the word psychology, and I would look at where I was on the list. You know, maybe I'm 25th and maybe I'm like 15th, or I don't know. And I wasn't like yelling at Apple or Steve Jobs or
suing them in court.
or you or something, you know, or yelling at you saying you got to be a better host.
You got to be better. We got to be number one.
Yeah, I never did that, but it was a bit of an obsession, if you will. And it kept me innovating, kept me striving to get better while I was working full time as a professor, half time as a therapist. I was going full time to get my doctorate.
Right.
I was in a band. I had family, you know, I had Stacy. So it's like, and on top of that, I was just, you know, a dash of Kanye, if you will.
Yeah.
Just always thinking, this podcast is good, and it just isn't. Not enough people have heard about it yet.
Yeah.
And if I can just get it to be heard by other people, then it'll manifest to, I guess, where you could say it is today. You know, I don't think I ever thought it would get to where it is today by any means, but I thought, like a few years ago, it got to the point where I was like, okay, this was my dream, and then it exceeded that dream. But my point is that for years, just, you know, not Kanye level, but like
nowhere near,
but but driving myself through thick and thin, no one listening.
Yeah.
You know, I was losing money every year. Right. People would listen to it and go like, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
We would get negative comments, you know, but day after day, year after year, just kept doing it, thinking, I have the beats, you know what I mean? I just have to get people to hear it. I just have to get into Rockefeller Records, and eventually everyone will realize. Everyone will realize. And so, you know, I do have a dash of narcissism, but I also was raised well enough to know that even without any kind of success in my life, I'm still a good enough human being. So I'm only slightly driven in that way. But anyway. So his, let's see. So as he starts to get famous, there start to be more and more yes men, people that will just, I don't know, but we could imagine.
It looked that way. For sure.
A lot of people just being like, you are the greatest, you're the best, and enabling, you know, the narcissism. And when another aspect that I saw in the documentary is that when and I thought it was really fascinating, because he would be talking kind of regular, to his friends, to Cootie and, Chike and others. And then he would be interviewed and this other Kanye would emerge.
Yeah.
And I for every time I saw it, I'm like, that's the Kanye I know.
Yeah, right.
Is just the rambling, narcissistic, confused, almost, and kind of nerdy. Like, he's not smooth even back then.
Yeah, totally.
Before
and
his
it's
accident.
always about, like you're saying, it's always about how great he is and how underrated he is.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was like a light switch that would just go on. He'd be laughing it up with his mom or joking around with his friends, and then he'd get in front of the camera and he'd just be like, and you're just like, what is going on there? And I think what it was, because another aspect was when he felt criticized, when someone would criticize him, it only happened a few times, he would just start talking and talking and talking, which I can slightly relate to, actually. That when I feel criticized, sometimes, in my personal life, particularly in my past, I had this false notion that, well, if I just explain myself, they won't criticize me anymore. But I need to monopolize the conversation for them to listen to me long. And you could almost say this podcast is an extension of that, because I got the microphone.
You're trying to explain yourself for 13 years.
It kind of is that way, It's this hope that people understand what's in my mind and will make me unassailable. You know what I mean? And so, did I use the word right?
In the sense that if you meant this, that people will come to your defense when others assail you.
No, that I'm uncriticizable.
Yeah.
Because if you understand fully what's in my head, then, similar to what you were saying earlier in terms of, wait, they believe I was in support of Cosby? What that I'm so worried about those misperceptions, because it mortifies me that I try to explain myself,
ad nauseum
and from 10 different angles, which lends itself to podcasting to some extent, but it's not very good when you're talking to your wife, for example. So I noticed that when he felt criticized, and I think he assumed he was being criticized whenever he was being interviewed. It almost seemed that way. Like, as soon as you saw that too.
Oh yeah.
Like, how did?
And again, I don't know if I haven't watched every interview, but that's the sense I got.
Like, without any criticism
from the get-go.
Like, they just say, Kanye, how's it going? And he just starts defending himself.
Yeah. Well, how's it going? Well, it's not going well when you're having to fight uphill every single day because no one's going to listen to you and realize you're the best of all time. And
and then the cameras would turn off, and he'd turn around and laugh and have dinner, and like it made me wonder, like, what was triggering about that. And I think it might have been like the public. He was transferring and displacing his dad maybe onto like the public or something.
Interesting.
And we saw an interesting scene at the end when he's talking to his dad on the phone, and he seems to be almost begging his dad to pay attention to him, even at the age of 45.
I was so confused at that scene because for some reason I was under the impression that either his dad had passed away or that he had zero contact with his dad. So when he's on the phone and he keeps saying something, Dad, I'm like, wait, what?
I think for many years he didn't have contact with his dad. Yeah. So let's see. Friend telling him to stop getting offended. Right. When interviewed, obsessed about who's on top. Very frequently. Okay. So that's all that part of him. The other thing I'll say from the documentary that we add to the personality profile is that he is a true artist. He, in so many ways, not just with hip hop, but with clothes, with religion, with public persona, with music videos, with art, paintings, and with everything. I mean,
it always has to be a thing. It's never just like, I'll just I'll hire a designer, just put out some coats with my name.
Right. He goes to the ceramic store and looks at the ceramics and has a conversation with the ceramic maker. Right. Whereas Jay-Z would be like, how about y'all just design something cool? Yeah. And I'll
let me pick from the top 3.
Yeah, I'll decide, or just do it for me or something,
And we don't know about Jay-Z, but the point is most people would do that.
Yeah. And so if Kanye wasn't a rap artist, I'm pretty sure he would have worked at an art gallery or something. I mean,
he'd be in some form of artistic expression for sure.
But not only expression, but he likes the whole thing. You know, he's nerding out.
Yeah.
Like while other guys his age with, you know, in his field are doing different kind. You know, they're going to the beaches, they're going to the parties, they're, you know, maybe playing the field women wise or something. Kanye's going to the ceramic store. He's going to the editing room. He's talking to the church chorus. You know, he's meticulously designing his videos.
Right. 3 times. Remember?
Yeah.
He did that Jesus Walks 3 times.
Yeah. Well past the point where most people of his ilk would have said, yeah, I think I'm kind of done.
I was, again, there was many times during this documentary that I was confused. The whole Jesus Walks thing, I was confused. I'm like, wait a minute. I must have misheard. I think they just said that he redid the video that was already out there. And who, you know, I can't think of a famous video that came out and then another version came out. But then I went to look for the versions. I could only find the second and the third version. I couldn't find whatever the original was.
Yeah.
Really weird.
So I think that's another part of his personality, in that he's like an Andy Warhol, someone who is enigmatic in that way and just kind of oriented almost personality wise in a, I don't know how to say it, just an art way. You know, like he doesn't look at a flower and go like, oh, a flower. He's like, oh, that flower, it symbolizes this and that. Like, you just imagine he's walking through the world, seeing how everything could move someone else, you know? And I think that's another big part of his personality. Also, okay, so let's talk about bipolar. So it looked to me like he had a very common development and onset of bipolar, where you might have been able to see little indications in his teens and early 20s, but mid-20s, late 20s, you start to see some pretty significant mood swings into mania and depression. Mainly, we see the mania. We don't see when he's depressed, I'm guessing he doesn't tweet. He doesn't do anything. But we see, at least in terms of his quote-unquote erratic behavior, it's when he's experiencing mania. So we start to see that show up a little bit more as he develops, as he gets older. And this is mainly a genetic thing, which I'll get into later, and we don't know why people, of course, trauma can exacerbate it for sure. And sometimes it's not potentially related to genetics, but the point is that I think, well, anyway, I'll get later to like getting rid of or disputing a lot of the common, like, the death of his mom caused him, because I don't think that, especially watching this documentary, like, oh, there's a consistent personality before and after his mom died. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know if his mom dying had that much to do with, but we'll get into that later. But my point is that he starts to develop bipolar independent of anything that's happening in his life, independent of his car crash, independent of his mom being alive or dead. And some of his symptoms are in the news. I'm guessing most of his symptoms are not in the news. He also, remember, he has a lot of yes men around him, and over time, people might be enabling his bipolar. And because one of the things about bipolar, I don't know about him, but he sounded like he might have had some elements of this, is that so let me briefly discuss bipolar. It's not the same for everyone, but he has a pretty common presentation of unmedicated. You can have you can slip into depression pretty easily. That can last for months, and then you pull out of depression and you get to what we would consider to be neither mania or neither manic or depressed. But then, and that can last for maybe a few months, and then you start to go into mania. Sometimes initiated by stress, maybe the release of a new album, for example. And you enter into what we call hypomania, which is submania. It's small mania, minor mania. In this zone, it is better than you and I have ever felt, and you're functional.
Interesting.
So you have energy,
Right.
you have self-esteem, you're interesting, you're making connections, you have dreams, you have goals.
All the benefits, few of the downsides.
Almost none. Like
Yeah.
like for many people with especially might I say like low grade hypomania, it's all benefit. You have confidence, you have energy.
Right.
You don't have headaches anymore. You don't have depression anymore. You're looking forward to you're optimistic.
Yeah.
You're interesting. You're funnier. People are attracted to you.
Nice.
There's a glow around you.
What could go wrong?
You've got juice, you know? You're waking up in the morning. You can't wait to hit the day, you know?
That sounds great.
You're cleaning the house. You're making appointments. You're calling people up that you haven't talked to before. You're in a good mood all the time. Then you enter higher hypomania, and this is when the consequences start to happen. And I think this is, so at very high mania is psychosis, where you actually believe you're God, you believe you're Jesus, or you believe that aliens are in your stomach and you start to stab yourself in the stomach to get the aliens out, you know, that kind of stuff. Not all people with bipolar go there. In fact, a small percentage do. But anyway, so at upper hypomania, going into mania, you have too much self-esteem, not sleeping at all. And of course, that can cause its own problems, right? Because you're not sleeping. Not understanding there are consequences to your actions. Being confused. Believing that everyone is your friend. Believing you can do anything to anyone and they'll forgive you because you're the best. Believing you're better than other people. Believing that you can become the next Versace. You can become the next Steve Jobs. You know?
Yeah.
That's too much self-esteem. Kanye, you're not going to be the next Steve Jobs. You know what I mean? You're going to be something, you know, you'll contribute, but you're not going to be that, you know, or the chance of it happening, or there's no evidence to believe that you're going to do that, you know? You are Kanye, which is, you're the Kanye of rap and of hip hop and pop music, but you're not going to be the Kanye of art. You're not going to, but when you're upper hypomanic or manic, you believe that you are, and you are 100% convinced that anyway, it starts to really mess with your mind, and your brain starts to short circuit with all the activity, and you start talking a lot, and you don't make a lot of sense, and you're rambling. And we saw a little bit of this in documentary, like when they were in that tropical region, and he's talking.
Oh my gosh, yes, and he's talking to his investors or his business associates, and he's just going on and on and on and on, and, and weaving in and out.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you want to know what we call pressured speech, that the symptom of bipolar looks like, watch this documentary, because, and I don't know if that's what we're seeing, but given the fact that he's come forward and says he has bipolar, I imagine that's what we're seeing. Is it's pressured in that it's rapid, it's confused, it's non-segued.
Right. And he even said, you know, I took my bipolar meds last night so I could talk to you.
Right.
So I don't know if that's true or if it's in spite of, you know.
Well, I would suspect that he's, you know, less symptomatic that day than he would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And now, having said that, he claims that he's taking alternative meds or alternative treatments for bipolar, which I've never heard of evidence of alternative treatments working for bipolar, especially for his type of bipolar. Like, you need the meds, you need lithium, you need the other sorts of meds potentially. And so the other thing is about bipolar is that when you become hypomanic, a couple things happen. One is you're like, holy shit, this is bipolar. I love bipolar. So you actually, and he has that album cover that's like, I have bipolar, it sucks, it's awesome, or what does she say?
Oh,
I
really?
hate it, it's awesome.
Okay, I didn't see that. Or I didn't know that.
Yeah, because everyone with bipolar when they go on their meds and it takes away their mania and their depression, for the most part, all of them or most of them miss hypomania because it is glorious.
Because they feel so good when they're that way.
Yeah, even if they're baseline, even if they feel like you and I, but they look at us and they say, "You don't understand what hypomania is.
Sure.
It's cocaine and crack without any of the consequence, because you're not harming your body, right? It's just you ramping up your own neurons." And so that's one thing that'll happen is they will miss that. The other thing is that when you're hypomanic, you're very optimistic, such that you don't think you need your medication. You're like, I'm fine.
Yeah, this is working out fine.
I've never felt better. And even if people are standing next to you going like, I think you're hypomanic, you're like, no, you don't understand. Not this time. I'm totally fine. You don't get it. Like, I'm just, things are going well. I'm really good,
Yeah.
And so a lot of people with bipolar, and they're notorious for this, is they will not take their meds.
Oh, man.
Because they, miss hypomania in a very logical, way, but they also have frequent notions that they're fine.
They feel great.
Yeah. And the meds have, side effects, right?
Yeah.
They're not, it's not all fun and games. The other thing that I think that we see is another common scenario with his type of bipolar is even when he's baseline, he's still not the same. Like, and I think Cootie kind of talked about that a little bit, that he's not the same as he used to be. Because when we saw that, like, there were times in the early documentary where he just seemed
totally
just like, not manic, not depressed. But there are some people with bipolar, and I've treated people like this, and I've treated families with a family member like this, where, 20 years down the line, even if they're med compliant and the meds are working, they're still not entirely the same.
I see.
There are various different ways of looking at it. One is that their symptoms never really go away. Another way of seeing it is that their moods almost affect their personality. Like if you frequently have mania, you almost brainwash yourself into believing certain things.
Right.
Or certain behavior patterns become habit. And so even though Kanye in that meeting with the investors, he seemed fairly rational at the time, it was just a little push, into, okay, I have the floor and I'm going down a road of maybe anxiety about trying to impress these people, or
and it starts building on itself, because you could tell it kind of like escalates to the point where his buddy goes, I don't think I should be filming this.
Right. There are a few times where you see him, and I thought that was a very effective storytelling, where he's like the first time he's like, I didn't want to film this anymore. Yeah. And then the next couple times you just see the camera turn off, and you're like, must have been one of those times when Cootie was like, and you just wonder, like, what happened beyond, or did it just kind of continue that way or something? I don't know. But
I've been around people, not often. It's been like 2 different instances where they were in what I guess, it sounds like a very manic, but like what do you say? High hypomania?
Well, it's hypomania, but I'm differentiating between low hypomania and high hypomania.
Yeah. So I've been around a person that I believe was in that high hypomania state, and it is very disconcerting because there are moments in the conversation where you feel like you can find a common ground and keep going with a normal conversation, and then it quickly moves off, and it is too random to follow.
Yeah, I'll get into that in a little bit, but I want to get back to my notes here. So he's still a normal human being, right? He still has insecurity. He's not fully encompassed by his bipolar. That doesn't explain everything. People will say, well, when he got up on stage with Taylor Swift, that's him being crazy. He's bipolar. And it's like, it's hard. He's a full human being.
Yep.
He purportedly, according to him, has bipolar, but he also has his personality.
Yeah.
So not everyone with bipolar gets on stage and decides to do something like that. We can't explain all of his behavior, due to bipolar anyway. But I want to emphasize something just before moving on, is that for some people with bipolar, and I've said this before like 5 minutes ago, but I want to know if you understand what I'm saying, actually, that even though he might have been medicated well enough, there was never a moment when he wasn't at least slightly symptomatic.
I get your point. So as you were talking about that, I was relating it. Of course, it's a totally different situation. But so I had thyroid problems last year. I led to me getting my thyroid removed, and now I take medication every single day. The medication, in theory, gets me back up to quote unquote normal levels. I don't know that I'll ever feel truly the same way I used to feel again, because what happens is that now I don't have an organ producing kind of graduated amounts of what I need based on my activity level, based on my stress. But I just have the same levels coming into my blood every day.
Yeah.
And so my body is always now different.
Right.
And I think similarly, maybe for some bipolar folk, maybe.
Yeah, right. That, I guess the analogy is that under a well-functioning brain, the neurotransmitters and other things involved in the nervous system are a system that reacts to equilibrium, eyes the situation, whereas when you just like strong arm your system into a medication, it doesn't actually respond the way that your human systems do. That's one part of it, but another part of it is that it changes your personality. In fact, some people will say that bipolar for some is almost like a personality disorder in addition to the mood disorder, in that it changes the way you see the world, whether that's a part of the brain different, or if the perpetual state of going into depression and mania gives you like different experiences that cause you to see the world differently, where you start to perpetually think that the world is against you, even though you're not experiencing paranoia in the classic sense. You're always kind of paranoid. You're always kind of angry. You're always kind of grandiose in the manic sense.
I also wonder if people that are close to someone, like in the Kanye case, had gotten used to seeing them in the lower hypomania state and got like, oh, well, that's cool. That's fine.
Right.
And then now, not only do they not really see that piece, they see maybe some of the bad pieces of higher hypomania, but also some of the depression. And like you're saying, the baseline doesn't feel the same. So,
right.
And that's a tough thing. Right.
So that's basically my conceptualization, where we have, he's a regular human being. He's not from outer space. He has regular issues of insecurity, a mild narcissism personality as a defense. He's a little nerdy, a little socially spastic, as I was when I was young, and so were you apparently. He has some chasing of the narcissistic supply. He starts to develop bipolar. He's also a true artist. He's very artistic, and he thinks in terms of art and in terms of performance. We also should add racism and also just being attacked for various different things that he did. I mean, the amount of vitriol that famous people get, particularly black people, is, it's pretty high. Yeah. So there's that. The next thing is he develops an addiction to painkillers, according to him, Percocet. It was hard to know when he became addicted. Was it the jaw surgery? Was it some other thing? Was it emotional pain? Did he just get addicted to it? It's not uncommon for people with various different problems to become addicted to something, whether it's narcissistic injury or even bipolar. I mean, the stress of, one of the things that I have learned over the years working with a lot of clients who suffer from addiction, either periodic or chronic, is that for some reason, when we're suffering, we want to suffer more, or we want to numb it.
Oh, interesting.
Because like with Percocet, for example, if you become addicted to an opiate and you want to cut back, you just know how good it feels. And so sometimes, and I would work with clients who would do this, is that they would say to themselves, well, I worked really hard this week and I got all my stuff done. So I deserve this Percocet.
Don't I deserve this? Yes.
Or I deserve to binge on food or on alcohol or cocaine. You know, I was a good boy, and so I deserve this. And when we're, like, for another example that we can maybe all relate to is, I'm under the weather, I have the flu. I deserve to eat 2 pizzas. I deserve to not exercise.
I'm going to be in bed all day watching TV.
Yeah, I don't have to exercise. I don't have to answer my work.
The universe owes me this because I'm sick.
Right. It's a very common human thing.
Totally.
Well, when you're chronically suffering the way Kanye, I think, is, there's a possibility where you just go like, hey, you know, I've had a rough day. I deserve to numb out on something, and Percocet does that for me. So it's another possibility. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go into the various different kind of myths here. Is that the way that people talk about him on the internet is just like, well, what do people say that, like, the taglines of the pundits or the Redditors
about Kanye?
Yeah, they'll just be, oh, that's people that don't know him that well. You know, it's like, well, that's Kanye doing again. What do they say?
I think there's probably 3 categories. There's the you know, Kanye will be Kanye because he's just crazy, and he just does chaotic, crazy things. You know, that's what he does. That's what he does for a living.
Yeah.
And
meaning he does it on a calculated way? Or?
No, he's just weird. He's just weird. I think that's one of the narratives.
Okay. He's actually mentally ill weird or weird?
No, I don't think that. I mean, and I'm just kind of expressing both what I used to hear and think.
Yeah.
So it's no, Kanye's just a weird cat.
Yeah.
He just does crazy weird stuff.
He's like Lady Gaga.
Yeah, but weirder.
Yeah.
You know, okay. Then there's another one, which is, and I think I kind of felt that I was this one, which was, Kanye used to be so normal. What happened to him?
I miss the old Kanye.
Exactly. Then there's a third one, which is, I kind of like this Kanye because he's saying what is unpopular to say. And this is
George Bush doesn't like black people.
Freaking Tucker Carlson, when he's watching himself being praised by Tucker Carlson. Kanye gained a lot of supporters from a different category of people when he was, doing a lot of things in the last couple of years. So,
right, well, just a side note on that. When you have massive narcissistic injury as a child to your self-esteem and you develop a defense of narcissism, you will chase whatever supply you can get.
Yep.
You might actually start as a liberal and then even as a politician and switch to something else because that group doesn't have a hero.
That's right.
And because if Kanye was liberal with his point of view, he would get praise, but it would just be like, well, of course that's what Kanye's saying, because that's what we all, that's what all of us believe. You switch sides, the other side they're gonna start praising you 100 times more,
right?
Because you're the defector.
Totally.
During the Cold War, when the Russian defects, you're gonna be paraded around.
Yeah, of course.
Whereas if you're just a regular American, they don't parade you around. But if you defect,
but are you saying like if a politician, let's say, has a narcissistic disorder or something, and they switch to be more on a different side, and then they get a following, like kind of like cult-like following.
So there's 2 things. One is if you switch. So I think Tucker Carlson, was reacting to Kanye because it felt like a victory for owning the libs.
Yes.
But also, if you have a group of people who have certain beliefs, QAnon, for example, and there's no legit hero, it's just like Kid Rock and the Scott Baio. Yeah. You don't have a hero, but someone else comes along and literally the president of the United States. Yeah. Then you're like, you will latch on to that hero and praise him literally throughout the day.
And if that hero happens to have narcissism, they'll latch on to that.
They will chase whatever supply. So you're just a moth to a flame. Yeah. So you don't care what you believe. One, because you're so distracted with narcissistic supply because you're so desperate to gain any semblance of self-esteem. But two, you don't have a self. You don't have a connection with the self. When you suffer from narcissism, because early life was difficult and you were neglected, you were never given a chance to figure out who you are and how you feel about things. And so things are going on down there, but you're not aware of it. And so you don't have convictions because you don't know how you feel about anything. And so you're only chasing outward evidence that you're a good person. And if a group of people has no hero and you can provide that hero and you just go, oh, this feels good. What do I need to say? Oh, I'll just keep saying these kinds of things because I keep getting this, if I stay in this stance, my liberal sort of mainstream stance, no one really praises me because they're just like, well, yeah, that's what everyone. But if I go over here, I'm literally getting praise all day long, So if you're Kanye, that could be a motivation.
And this was the perfect storm for him because the topic in question was about abortion. And he's got this super deep personal connection where he I don't know if the story was real or not, but his story is that his dad wanted his mom to abort him. Mm-hmm. And she didn't, and that's the only reason he lived.
He also, I think, was
claims
claiming
that he was going to have an abortion for his kid. And
he was trying to convince Kim, yeah.
And so for him, this is super personal. And if you think about it, his dad wanting his mom to abort him ties directly to his dad rejecting him and making him totally unvalued. So now he's sitting there going, and he's got a whole audience. Forget Tucker Carlson, like a whole religious section of people that would agree with him. Like, yeah, that's wrong. And then comes someone saying, no, he's not wrong to say this. Of course, like this is gonna, like one thing's just gonna build on top of each other.
Right. So just to put a fine point on one of the points that I'm making is that if he's pro-choice, then most of his fans are just going to say, well, yeah, of course you are, because all the other, all of us are. And
you're on that section of the world.
They're not even going to comment. He's like pro-choice, people are like, huh?
Yeah.
Whatever. But he says he's anti-abortion.
Right.
He's going to get not only a lot of hate, AKA attention, but he's going to get a lot of praise. Like overnight, he's going to get a lot of noticing of who he is. Right. And I'm not saying he did that, but there's a possibility that unconsciously the moth just flies to the flame. The narcissistic individual flies to where the supply is. They don't care how they're getting it, especially if they're not getting enough at the time, right? Yeah. And then they can feel terrible about themselves later on, Anyway, I think that's a huge oversimplification. But what else are people saying about Kanye, like that don't really delve into the story of Kanye? What are they saying? Like Kanye, well, he's just blank.
I think that there's definitely a narrative over the last 2 years that he finally did go, I think, quote unquote crazy.
Right.
Because he appeared to be running for president. He had a press conference that was completely off the rails. Kim left him, on and on. There were one too many examples where people could no longer just write it off as, well, that's, he's wacky. He just does wacky things.
Right. Or he's trolling.
He's trolling.
Yeah, this is the dominant narrative that's been around for a while, which is just like he's insane. And literally everything he does all day long is from insanity. And not insanity in terms of like a real mental illness, but what I might consider to be like Arkham Horror version of insanity, right?
Sure.
Like, like cartoon.
I'm gonna get you, Batman.
Just, the cartoon version of someone who's quote unquote insane. And
by the way, I didn't like that last part of, spoiler alert of.
No. We'll talk about that another time.
But it's because of that, because it was the cartoony version of the craziness.
Right. I see. Yeah, of the Batman. Yeah, I mean, but anyway, point is that there's this myth about mental illness that's what it looks like, and I think it could do people good to watch this documentary because you're seeing someone who purportedly has bipolar, but behind the scenes they are anything but that. They're not. He's actively in the throes of his disorder.
Yeah.
And yet he's still working. He's managing to have dinner. He's not alienating people around him. Maybe 10% of the time he goes on rants that don't make a lot of sense. But but then he stops and then he goes on with his day. This is the potentially ongoing mundane life of someone who suffers from bipolar, one type of it anyway. But yeah, so the probable myths that people have that I think need to be dispelled, that being one of them. Another one is that people will say, well, he's really going through something right now. And Cootie kind of had that point of view, like, oh, he's going through something.
Mm-hmm.
And I
like, meaning it's going to be something that ends.
Right.
I see.
No, he's not going through something. He has a permanent, in all likelihood, condition.
Like his mom died. He's going through something.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like he's stressed out and he just needs to work it out, and he'll.
You need to take a break.
Right.
Just take a break.
It's like, no, that's not going to. If he has bipolar, it's not going away. The other myth that I thought I was going to actually find evidence for in this documentary was that the grief over his mom is what broke him. In fact, someone watched this documentary, a friend of mine, and they were telling me, like, oh yeah, it really shows that, like, when his mom died, oh, that's when and I thought when I watched this documentary, I was going to see a very mundane Kanye
until that point.
Mom dies and then whoa, right? But it was like, and it's hard to know exactly what happened because it's all just footage pieced together, but the way it looked to me, and I don't know, but the way it looked to me is he had all those things that we talked about: narcissistic, mild narcissistic spectrum, bipolar, nerdiness, all that kind of stuff. And it's particularly his bipolar was starting to ramp up. Mom dies. He went through a tough few months there because it's going to be tough.
Yeah.
And he's going to be maybe a little bit more symptomatic, but it was just a bump in a road that he was already going down.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you had that insight, because when I watched it, I actually also got the impression. I think the documentary actively tried to set that impression.
Right.
Because I was thinking, how are we going to get from the first 2 episodes to this last third episode? Like, what did happen? And actually, at the beginning, they're like, and then his mom dies.
Right.
So I had that impression. I didn't catch on to what you're saying. Obviously, now that as you've described it, it makes total sense. Well, yeah, the narrative was already there. Like, the progression was there. And just from thinking from one's own life, no one dramatic event, unless when we're talking about these very early events, but is the be-all, end-all.
Right. It's very similar to the Brian Epstein dying narrative. That it's like the Beatles were fine, Brian Epstein dies, and then everything falls apart. And it's just like, well, if Brian Epstein was still around, maybe they could have squeezed out another couple of years, but things were trending in a direction.
Right.
And with Kanye, I believe that to be true as well. I don't know, but it's, we saw, I mean, I was so surprised that I was like, oh my God, he's always been that Kanye who rants and raves and is insecure and doesn't make a lot of sense when he's just going off in an interview. He was doing that way before he was famous.
But I think if you're not trained in this, so even someone like me who's talked to you about things like this for 13 years, when I see it, it's harder for me to notice the pattern early on. Yeah. Because it's so small compared to how it is later.
Right. The other thing is that when you aren't a podcaster that spends, 10 hours researching Kanye and watching all these things, you just want a simple narrative, which is, well, when his mom died, that's what broke him. And then you can walk away and you feel like you have a story.
So just make sure your mom doesn't die.
Yeah. And just think about all the people who's had, their mom died at some point. It's like that, it doesn't explain it. So the other thing that we heard, I think, in the documentary were notions like he just needs to find peace, that kind of thing.
I know. That's such a, okay. So I admit, before I got seriously ill with something, I had that impression about life, because I think, when we're younger and we're generally healthy, in our minds, getting sick means I had a cold for 3 days. Sometimes it's like 5 days, but then it passes.
Right.
And even if you break a leg, you're like, oh, I broke my leg in college. But then it healed.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you never played as fast, whatever, but it was a time and now it's gone. I tore my chest, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And, it was never the same, but I still got over it, right?
Yeah.
But some things are not like that.
Right.
And bipolar is obviously one of those things.
Right.
They don't just go away one day. It's not just 2 weeks of bad stuff.
Right. And it sucks.
Yeah.
But it's the truth. I was talking with a friend of mine who's going through something kind of tough right now in her life. And I was telling her, in all likelihood, you're going to hurt from this for the rest of your life.
Oh, man.
This is going to be painful. And she, was very upset about that, actually. And she's like, in this playful way, she's like, don't say that, and I'm like, yeah, I know that this isn't the best thing to hear right now, but I'm telling you this so that you don't get your expectations up, and also that you recognize the weight of what's happening right now. This isn't just a small thing. And also that you recognize that, it attenuates over time, but it's going to be the most severe right now. And it means that you need to treat it as such. It's not going to go away tomorrow, for example, because it's never going to go away, know? So if this has a long tail, it obviously has a huge bump right now. And so anyway, we just want to believe, particularly as Americans, that with the right treatment, we'll be okay and we'll recover and we'll be able to move forward. We just need to find peace, that kind of thing. Another myth is that fame drove him crazy, right? Which doesn't make a lot of sense.
Although my question earlier was rhetorical, but it is interesting to wonder, bipolar maybe not, but it's interesting to wonder what would have happened to someone like Kanye who reaches middle success and not the extreme success. And I was curious about whether that would have been beneficial or actually more hurtful.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would hypothesize it would have had no effect. Well, let me think. So I think it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, he can go to bed at night knowing that a lot of people agree, millions of people agree, that he is a genius, that he is the spokesperson for his generation,
right?
That he is the potential, he's up there with Michael Jackson, maybe even better than Michael Jackson, so that helps potentially not only one's self-esteem, but also his narcissistic supply, and then the continual yes men around him saying that. But the other side of it is that when you're told you're superior, because one of the nice things about getting older, if you do have narcissism, maybe you can speak to this, is that eventually you learn you're not going to be Einstein.
Right.
And life slaps you across the face and says, this is your life. You're not, you didn't even get close to Einstein.
Right.
So it forces you to have to learn other self-esteem vectors.
That's right.
And you have to face that and go, okay, well, then who am I? Instead of superior and the best mathematician of all time, who am I? I guess I'm a father, I'm a husband,
right.
I'm a friend, I'm a coworker, I'm just a regular person, but I have good qualities. That's the downside to actually becoming the most popular pop artist of your generation.
That's true. And there's another thing that he's already having to contend, and it's going to get worse. I was reading, for example, a review for Donda 2, which is his most recent album. And it was not complimentary, and they were saying, Kanye is no longer the new thing in town, and blah blah blah, and I wonder how that starts hitting someone with these,
right?
Issues.
Maybe it'll help him in that way, like I said. Yeah. Now I want to let me just go through these other myths. The other is that the car crash broke him, or that the head injury was, and it's possible. There's no way to know that. But again, before the car crash, before the head injury, we saw definite signs of what we saw later.
Yeah.
There's no way to know, but I would suspect that his car crash probably had no effect on the progression of his bipolar and his issues.
You're probably right. What I will say, which is interesting, is if you think about his own self-narrative, one thing the car crash did do is it gave him almost a mystical, holy part of the narrative.
Yeah. And
that like reinforces the greater than normal, even godlike thing.
Right. Which also made me wonder, because that was his first successful album, if he equates throughout his career some kind of personal drama or self-injury of some kind to every album. You know, it's because he's famous for every album that he releases, there's some kind of controversy.
Yeah, and he was even talking in that one of those final interviews that they were showing, where he was saying, well, you know, I need to talk about different things now that I am rich and, you know, I'm famous and stuff. So I want to talk about suicidal thoughts, and I want to talk about, remember he was talking to Justin Bieber about that. He also made a very interesting comment in that scene, at the beginning of that scene, where he said, I'm tired of telling my team over and over and over, like a million times, what I want. Something like, I got the sense like he was really frustrated that he wasn't able to communicate what he wants to his team.
Music team?
Yeah, because they were trying to put together the album. And so I was wondering if that was becoming harder for him to, you know, because of his symptoms, like he was starting to make less sense to his team, and then that makes him more frustrated. Yeah. And he might blame them, like, you guys just don't understand.
Right. And you and I know people who are narcissistic to the point where when their song that they wrote that you're trying to help them with isn't a, you know, number one hit,
it's your fault.
It's because you didn't translate what was in their head well enough. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that people might say is like, well, he just needs therapy. And it's like, there's no therapy for bipolar. There's no psychotherapy. There is psychotherapy to work on coping or workarounds kind of thing. Like, how can you, when you feel compelled to do pressured speech, how do you kind of interrupt that? Or how do you tell people around you? By the way, I might occasionally rant about things. And it seemed like he actually was doing some of that. He kind of knew, particularly I think in recent, maybe a couple years, I think he's starting to become much more comfortable with the fact that he has bipolar, and that it's not just persecution that's causing these kinds of problems, you know. He actually does have a condition that causes some issues. The other thing that people say is that he's just trolling people, you know, because I remember when we did the episode in 2019, that was still a contender. Yeah. Because you just like, well, because sometimes he seems to be aware of how he's messing with people, which I think is still true. Yep. But I also think, you know, I
remember feeling that for sure when we did that episode. Seeing you know, I remember actually the time where I started thinking, wait a minute, I don't know, this seems like it's not a troll after all. Was actually one of the times they brought him in to talk to Trump, or he was like at the White House and he was talking, and he just seemed so sincere. Right. That I was like, maybe this is really, he really believes what he's saying right now.
Yeah. And it's not uncommon for, what do I say, people with his various identities, whether it's black or male or his generation or a rich person, to have, you know, we did an episode on Bill Cosby. The way that Kanye talked was very similar to the way Cosby talked. Yeah. Just like black people are lazy and, you know, all these kinds of racist ideas. And of course, we understand internalized racism. He did
that. He said, that one got him into so much trouble. It was the slavery. You've chosen to be a slave for 400 years or something.
Right. Yeah. And so, anyway, another idea that Cootie puts forward is that he thought that it was a cry for help. So, what do you think that means?
But that's such a pop psychology term, you know, like that gets thrown around all the time. Right. Oh, that's a cry for help. That suicide attempt was cry for help. That was a cry for help. Right. And I feel like it's something that at some point, some psychologist or psychiatrist some years ago, 50 years ago said, well, you know, in a way, this is a cry for help. And then it caught on like wildfire.
Right. And it does happen.
So sure. I mean, I guess a lot of these things that is one of the ingredients. As an example, I remember one time that I was very, very intoxicated and I started destroying a tree because I was angry at my mom. Well, okay, so someone could absolutely look at that scene and be like, wow, that's a cry for help. And it is.
Yeah.
But I don't know where it gets us.
Yeah. Now, for Kanye, maybe there were some elements of deep suffering and he acts out as a way of trying to cry for help. It's a very dysfunctional way of crying for help. But I think that just assuming that every time he shows up in the media with a controversial interview, that it's a cry for help, that doesn't fit with my conceptualization of why he was doing those things.
Or a different way to think about it is, I mean, in the sense that when you see some of the worst situations that he gets into, from the outside looking in, especially if you're a friend, you would say, oh, Kanye might need help. I think someone, maybe me, might need to try to help, whether you can or can't. And in that sense, well, yeah, it's at least implicitly a cry for help. But I think the difference is thinking Kanye doesn't even know why he went on stage, but really he just wanted someone to come to his hotel room that night and tell him he loves him,
right,
or something like that. And I agree with you that I don't think it's like that. I think it's in a way simpler than that, but also more layered.
Right. Now, we haven't talked about attachment, and let's kind of conclude with that, is that recently him and Kim are going through a divorce, and news reports, you can look at all the news reports. I'm not familiar with all the ins and outs, but there's also reports that Kim and Pete Davidson are together.
Yep.
And Kanye is tweeting or something, making statements that are very angry and aggressive towards Kim, and talking about how Pete Davidson has AIDS or something.
He said that?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Which is just like a weird, I don't know, is it homophobic or so? I don't know. It's a joke from the 80s that you would say, right?
I don't know. Pete
even
Davidson does look like he's on drugs often.
But even if Pete Davidson had HIV, it's not the stigma that it used to be.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And that is,
and to out someone like that is,
I had not heard that. That's
I mean, I don't know the veracity of all this stuff, but
odd.
anyway, the summary that I'll say is that I've been hypothesizing that Kanye had attachment injuries growing up that led to schemas of inferiority, that led to defenses of narcissism, and of course, another way to describe that is attachment insecurity and a working model of self that has to be superior and a working model of other that can't be trusted, that they're going to abandon you. And my impression of Kanye was that he mostly avoided companionship relationships throughout a lot of his life.
Right. And in fact, unless you're doing this kind of analysis, it was really puzzling at the time. I'm like, Kim Kardashian?
Yeah.
But if you think about it, and I'm not saying he did this explicitly, but if you think about it, it's like, oh, okay, I can't have Beyonce, but who's like someone like massively famous, super popular, that would be the only other possible queen I could have.
Right. And maybe some Jay-Z worship, maybe Jay-Z was the father he never had.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
so then he's got to have Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, he's got to have something similar. And so he gets, the, I don't know what to call it, the runner-up to Beyonce or something. But also, who knows why, there's a lot of rich people, Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, Christy Brinkley and...
what about Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds?
They're married.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying that they were getting divorced.
No. So, right. I should say why I'm saying what I'm saying is that there's a known phenomenon where famous people...
Well, yeah, because you meet in famous circles.
Well, that's the hypothesis, but in all likelihood, famous people meet 99% of the people they meet are not famous. So the hypothesis that is from social psychology is that we tend to be attracted to and pursue relationships with people that we feel are at our level. So whether that's looks or prestige or social standing. There's some, and of course this sounds really ugly, right? That
No, I mean it's a fact for sure.
Right, but when you propose, for some reason, whenever I propose this to people, a lot of the times I'll get a real cringy face from people, and I'm just like, just look around, like super poor people don't except from the movies, don't usually get married to like extremely rich, super unconventionally conventionally non-attractive individuals don't usually marry conventionally attractive people. Like, we all understand that.
I think
right?
a lot of people have a very idealized notion of relationships, even though the evidence isn't there in reality. And so I got in trouble, for example, when we did the episode about the Tinder swindler, because I was relating my initial feelings when the documentary started, saying that, wow, like, that's tough competition. How can you compete against a billionaire?
Right.
Some people are like, why are you calling dating a competition? Dating shouldn't be a competition.
Yeah. But a lot of people also were relating to you.
Oh, no, absolutely. But I'm just saying that I think a lot of people would say, dating shouldn't be a competition. Relationships shouldn't be a competition. And I'm like, well, that sounds great and good, but in reality, people do compete.
Right.
And in this case, it is true. You're right that there is that kind of like equal levels trying to find themselves. I also think a lot of times these pairs had a movie together. That happens a lot.
But I think that's what introduces them, but what attracts them is this, not only the equal level.
I'm saying what you are saying, but I'm adding to it because I think you can't discount the fact that they are around those other people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
but often the pairing is so, like, how many Ryan Reynolds marry a producer or a cinematographer? They're probably around those people just as often as they're around the Blake Lively's of the world, but it's frequently of similar fame, and sometimes you'll see when one person starts to rise, you'll see tension and then divorce, for example. Another reason that is pretty obvious is that you want to be with someone that understands your life, right? And so when you're of famous like Kanye, to be married to just a regular human, you might not relate to each other very well. Whereas Kim and Kanye could absolutely relate to each other in terms of their plights as famous people.
In that sense, yes, yeah.
Now, who knows what happened between Kim and Kanye? Maybe that story will come out, but it looks like Kim rejected Kanye. That's the way it's looking. And for Kanye, if he grew up with attachment injury growing up, abandonment by dad in particular, and maybe at least mild neglect from mom, probably because she had to work so much, he has sensitivity to abandonment, which might have caused him to avoid romantic relationships,
right,
to some extent. And then when he finally opened up and decided to marry someone with Kim, he became, I could imagine, conflicted, if you will, about his attachment to her.
Sure.
I mean, who knows? But we could imagine Kanye, especially with bipolar in the mix, that their relationship had some, interesting moments. Now, I can also imagine Kanye just being super nice, and I don't know, there's a lot of speculation, but I could, given the way we saw him, particularly around his mom, I could see him being very subservient to Kim in a lot of ways, like looking, not subservient, but very kind, like a puppy dog, like, hey, love me. I could imagine him doing that to Kim. Who knows? But the point is that something happens to the relationship, they start to break up, and this old injury really kicks in for him, and he starts to become more symptomatic maybe as well, but he plummets in terms of his self-esteem, in terms of his emotional regulation, and he becomes very angry.
And his apparent successor in his eyes is like some side comedian from Saturday Night Live. Like, what the hell,
Yeah,
Like,
but I think anyone who dated Kim would have received his wrath.
Oh, absolutely. But imagine that she went out with, like, I don't know, 50 Cent or something, It'd be harder for Kanye to, like, get on Twitter and be like, you suck,
Yeah. Well, But
First of all, because 50 Cent would probably punch him.
Right. But I'm guessing that it doesn't matter who Kim was with, or even if she was with no one, that his hurt and his pain and his anger, and you match that up with potential bipolar ups and downs. You match that up with his tendency to speak, and he has a value. I almost consider him, that whole artist bit I was talking about earlier, like Andy Warhol. I almost consider him to be so artistic that he considers public statements to be, when Andy Warhol gave a speech, you can imagine him thinking, how do I make this art? I'm not just gonna give a speech.
That's exactly why I think this is exacerbated, because Pete Davidson is the ultimate slacker.
Right.
And he doesn't try hard.
Right.
He wouldn't give a speech. He doesn't, that's his persona. That's what he's also white and taller.
Right.
So it's like, there's a lot of
thinner.
things.
I think Kanye has some insecurity about his weight.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on.
Yeah. So, but my point is that I think he's suffering greatly, because again, when you look at his behavior, if you just on the surface, you're like, there's the Taylor Swift, there's the abortion thing, there's the MAGA hat, and now he's saying Pete Davidson has AIDS. It fits into this very simple narrative of like Kanye's being crazy or he's trolling.
There goes
Kanye. And I think it's much deeper than that, much more mundane than that. He's a jilted husband who feels very hurt, and he has a lot of relational traumas, and he's losing his shit, but he's probably mostly keeping it together. He's probably like, 23 hours out of the day, he's fine. And then eventually, and occasionally he has a reaction, and he has a yes man around him, not like confronting him, like, dude, like, stop it. You can't. And he just flies off the handle. And he also considers it like his prerogative to like speak whenever something's on his mind, because he's keeping it real. Like he has that value of like, people can handle the truth, that kind of thing. And so he says these things, and I'm pretty sure the next day he regrets it. Yeah. Like, I don't think he stands by the kind of horrible, I mean, he was also threatening Kim or something. The kinds of things that are coming out towards Kim are atrocious. Like, it's way beyond, I can't remember exactly what. You haven't seen the reports?
I haven't seen, the only thing I knew was Pete Davidson's going out with Kim, Kanye's going a little batty. But I didn't know the details.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's, I can't remember if it's misogynistic or threatening or so, but it's bad. And so I want to add to the mix attachment injury and how that can really, that dovetails with the whole discussion of narcissism and self-esteem and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, man.
The very last thing I'll say, Berto, and tell me what you think of this, I'm guessing this did resonate with you, is putting all that aside.
Yep.
This documentary is inspirational to me.
Yeah.
I'm watching this and I'm like, this guy is a genius in a certain way. This guy is a true artist. This guy is a good person deep down. This guy is a visionary. This guy, he's not the joke that people kind of make him out to be, right?
Oh, no. I totally agree with you. Twice in the first episode and the second episode. Not so much the third one, because I had to watch it yesterday in a hurry so we could do the show. But I got inspired. After watching the first episode, I started writing a new song.
I knew it.
And after watching the second episode, I basically, I sort of did more work that day. Like I just like pushed myself harder that day. And I kept thinking to myself, really, I got to work harder. Like, this guy really works hard. I got to work harder.
Right.
So it was inspirational.
Yeah. I mean, he's always, okay, what do we do here? And what do we do here? And he really pours himself into it, and he doesn't hold back. Like, the whole Jesus is King thing was such a stretch for his career. And he made something really beautiful. And, he's just a fascinating human being.
Yeah.
You just wonder what his life could have been like and what he could have been like for our culture if he wasn't mildly narcissistic, if he wasn't bipolar, if he didn't have the attachment injuries. And of course, what people will say is, well, he wouldn't be who he was. And I don't know,
No. I mean, certainly you could tone his symptoms way down and he's still the same genius.
Right. Like you look at John Lennon and Paul McCartney, not that everything comes back to the Beatles, but it kind of does, is both geniuses and both wrote beautiful music. One had massive attachment injuries and emotional problems and addiction problems, and the other one didn't.
Yeah.
And so it just, if anything, it hindered John.
Yeah,
and took him out of the game for a while.
No, that's a great point. Now, granted, you're always rolling the dice with humans. Some humans have talent, but Kanye's talents musically weren't because of his attachment injuries.
Yeah, Jay-Z, for example, he has, I'm sure, his issues, but they're not on the level of Kanye.
No.
But I think that's another myth. That it's just like, well, that's what drives him. The bipolar is what drives him, and it's just like, no, bipolar is not fun. It really is not fun, particularly. Really all of it, but the depression side of it is when we don't even hear from him.
Yeah,
he probably doesn't tweet at all. He doesn't record at all. He doesn't write at all. He doesn't interview. He doesn't allow any cameras to be around. Like, if I don't know, but typically when you go into a depressive side, we should point out that in the documentary they go over that he was involuntarily hospitalized.
Yeah, right.
Which means that, and he was his own psychiatrist called 911.
Yeah.
Or some authority and said, you've got to evaluate him. So we don't know, but typically what that means was he was extremely symptomatic and not making sense at all and threatening, I think, to kill himself.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. He's probably suicidal.
And then the MHPs show up, and they detailed this in the news report that they conducted a 90-minute assessment and determined that, because a lot of those assessments, they're trying to determine symptomology very briefly, but they're also trying to determine, are you willing to comply with treatment?
Mm-hmm.
Will you go to the hospital voluntarily?
Yeah.
And if not, then they're like, well, and you have to be imminently suicidal. Like,
totally.
Like, lots of clients think about suicide. Lots of clients attempt. Lots of clients think, I might die of suicide one day.
But they're not going to get committed.
They're not going to get committed. You have to be imminently in danger of killing yourself and have the means and all that kind of stuff. And so we don't know, but we have to add that to like our picture of what's going on behind the scenes. Someone who at times is suffering greatly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because we don't have those video clips of him being massively depressed and suicidal.
Yeah. So just a little bit in conclusion about just some other notes on the doc that I have is this kind of reminded me a little bit of like the Hip Hop Get Back, the Beatles documentary. You know what I mean? Because a lot of it is just behind the scenes conversations where you see the humanizing of Kanye,
And then you see the little interspersed of, that's when he did that song. That's when he did that song.
Yeah. The other thing that I think I kind of knew, but didn't know fully until this documentary, is that producers, the dudes who make the background music, are treated like crap in the industry.
They seem very disposable.
Yeah, they
do and they don't. Like, for example, they knew to call Kanye. Like, but it only went to a certain point.
But when, for example, Ringo Starr provides the drum track, he's on the album cover.
Right.
Kanye,
no one knows.
Yeah, he's a liner note.
No one knows.
Yeah, for those hits that Jay-Z made, Kanye, it should be Kanye and Jay-Z, but it's not.
It's not.
This is Jay-Z's song.
Yeah.
And so as a producer, you just hand over basically the half of the song.
Yeah, it made me think about how songwriting used to be in the kind of the puppy mill songwriting, like in Motown and things. It's like those songwriters, they would just crank out song after song after song. The artists got famous and big. No one knew who the songwriters were.
Right. Which is, I thought was interesting. And as a nerd who the two of us will slave over beats and sounds and the music, we could, perhaps feel bad for the people, the Kanyes of the world prior to being famous.
the other thing that I noticed is that rap studios are extremely small. Like Kanye's studio that he recorded,
Right.
like at least one of his albums, was in a corner of a room with a pool table.
Because you don't need an orchestra. Well, nowadays,
Yeah, he's got his mic, he's got his Akai, he's got a small little board.
Yep.
There's just a little preamp.
By the way, that room he was recording in, that one, I forget which one it was. There's no sound. There was no sound treatment here.
Yeah.
I could hear the echo. I was like,
massive echo that I'm guessing they just worked with.
Yeah.
I was just like, that makes sense.
Well, it's like the first Shin's album. He recorded all himself in his house,
But it makes sense, of course, because it's all, 808s and 909s. And so anyway, that was what I said. Oh, the other thing I kept wanting, maybe we said this earlier, I wanted the documentary because I feel like this is a lot of people's only exposure to production of hip hop, was I wanted them to really show, and they didn't,
makes a beat.
How hard it is to make a beat sound that good. Because I think it can come across to people like, well, you're just using a drum machine. And it's like, no, you don't understand.
Right.
Like, that's one way of saying it, but if you get 99 other, talented people, producers, they try to do what Kanye did, and it'll sound like shit. And Kanye, using the same equipment, he doesn't have some magic box. He's using, the Roland 808 or the 909 or the 707 or the Lind, drum machine. He's using some regular keyboard. He's sampling the same, he has the same library of songs that he can sample from. And the fact that he could meld those together and make it move,
and it's very, very subtle because, and I'm not actually good at this. I can't, if you were playing me like here's a beat. Actually, the first time I noticed that I wasn't that good at this, in the movie 24-Hour Party People, and this isn't even hip hop, but there's a scene where the Happy Mondays came back with their latest track, but it had no vocals. And when it starts playing, I thought to myself, oh, what a joke. That sounds terrible. And they all go like, well, this sounds pretty good, but where's the vocals? And in that moment, I realized,
oh wait, I think you said it differently originally in the story. So they came with just the beat and not the vocals.
But they didn't know. No one knew. It's supposed to be their latest CD, their latest song, and it started playing. Now, when the song starts playing, because I know that in that moment in the movie, I've seen that they were just fucking around in the Bahamas, so I know that this is not going to be the real song. So when the song starts playing, I think to myself, oh, that sounds terrible. But the people in the movie say, okay, this sounds pretty good, but where are the vocals? Uh-huh. In that moment, I realized, so there's some kinds of music where what I think I need to hear is not what is there. And hip hop is absolutely one of those.
Right.
Where if you play me a beat, I might be like, yeah, it's a beat. But Kanye or JC might be like, that sucks. Or they might be like, that's genius. Right. And I couldn't tell you that.
Right.
And it's subtle because, like you said, 100 other people could come in with beats that to me would be like, that's bumping, whatever.
Or that's fine.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, that sucks. If one of the moments in the movie that was so tough, which showed that Kanye isn't always, at least back then, reacting to criticism. Remember, he wanted that one rapper to rap on his songs, and he's playing the songs, and he plays one of them. Mm-hmm. And the guy's like, that song is no good at all.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else?
Yeah.
Imagine, like, someone you look up to comes in to record. You play them one of the songs you want, the main song you want him to rap on, and he's like, yeah, do you have anything else that's cut?
Yeah,
that's
my
really
heart, my heart was breaking for Kanye because I've been there before.
But he was totally cool about it. I mean, he seemed cool about it.
Right. Yeah, he didn't, and you didn't get the impression that afterwards he like broke a chair or something.
Right. But similar thing where like, now the guy was technically wrong because the song ended up being good. But
the other part of it is like that guy probably has thousands of producers trying to get him to rap over their music every day,
and that's not his style anyway.
Yeah. So,
but that's the kind of thing where like Kanye would have to show up to imagine showing up to like work with Jay-Z and be like, here's a beat, and it's like you have a couple seconds. In those couple seconds, they'll like it or not like it. And in those couple of seconds, they go, ooh, yeah, there's something here.
Right.
That takes skill. That takes
time. And it's the mood you're in,
Yeah.
Along those lines, I have come to realize that Pharrell is perhaps the nicest, most inspirational person on the planet.
I know, right?
Like, because I've seen other interviews where he is like hyping up some new artist or something, and when Pharrell comes, because there's so many scenes where
He's so great.
where Kanye is, like when Mos Def shows up,
Yeah.
but prior to that, you just feel bad for Kanye because he's just not. People reckon, oh yeah, you were that guy, and hey, what's up, dude? But like when Pharrell comes on the scene, not only is he complimentary, he's just like, this is genius. And now, on one hand, I think Pharrell just probably says that to everyone on some level. But on the other hand, Pharrell is a genius himself.
Yeah, no, I'm not so sure because he is one of those people that has the ear to tell good from bad.
Right.
And so coming from him, and he would have known it, Kanye would have known it. Coming from him, that was like a ridiculous compliment.
Yeah, I mean, he was like running up and down the hallway going like, this is amazing.
Do you know who Nardwuar is?
No.
The interviewer, the Canadian interviewer Nardwuar. He's this really, really weird, dorky, nerdy guy. That's his persona, who interviews rap artists, and he's got 40 years of doing interviews. He interviewed Pharrell one time, and Pharrell was so impressed by the guy's questions, and he was so kind about it, like, this is the best interview I've ever had. And it was this same kind
That's
of
what I'm saying. Pharrell's
really warm.
Yeah, watching this documentary, I was like, okay, Pharrell's the nicest person. The last thing I'll say is I liked how it shows how hard you have to work to get into the business, how you have to know the right people, how you have to, persevere through adversity.
Well, because he knew the right people. He was in the industry.
Yeah.
He was in the room where it happened.
Yeah.
And he still couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Until he did it, but
yeah, but he's into the pushing, because on a much, much, much smaller level, this podcast I wasn't working against adversity per se, because I didn't have to work with labels or anything like that. But the doggedness, because people will ask me sometimes, it's like, how do I get a successful podcast? And one of the very first things I always say is, you have to love this through years of it without anyone listening, because if you can do that, you might succeed.
Yeah.
But if you're going to get discouraged 3 years from now when your numbers are still terrible and you're doing this every week and no one's paying attention, and you'd rather just watch Netflix instead of develop a outline for an episode, then you probably shouldn't become a podcaster or a content producer, But so when you watch Kanye, it's just like, he saw the vision, and he just kept pursuing it. Now, for every Kanye, there's 1,000 others who don't make it, but just to create the possibility of making it, so to speak, you have to have that doggedness that he had.
We at least can say the following. Yes, it's true. We don't see the other stories. But in a lot of these cases, Jordan, this guy, tons of these examples of the golfer guy, like Tiger Woods and stuff, the work involved is off the charts.
Yeah.
And yes, they got lucky, and yes, they had skills, but so in other words, the one thing you can't skimp on is the work.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which it seems like a lot of the rappers, that's what they did.
Some do get lucky, right? There are plenty of stories in rap and music, whatever, of one-hit wonders or maybe even several hit wonders that don't try that hard, and they just really were
kind of
right
random.
place, right time.
Well, I don't know. It's funny because, well, anyway, point is that I liked how they showed that, but So in conclusion, about Kanye is that he's after seeing the documentary, which I recommend if you haven't seen, it's really interesting, particularly if you like hip hop. I mean, there's so many little guest appearances of different artists and like, oh, that's where he was when he made that video, and all these, and that's how he decided to do that thing. And so it's, to me, the documentary shows that he's a human being, a well-rounded, three-dimensional, regular person with just regular, mundane personality traits that everyone might have. But he also has issues. One significant one being bipolar, that is not fun for him. And you see the tenderness in him. You see the real Kanye in this documentary, I think. You know, when he's hanging out with his mom, you don't get the impression that he's putting on any kind of show for her.
There are a lot of scenes with her for sure, but with his friends and even in the latter scenes that you can it still shines through. Like, okay, there's that real Kanye right there.
Right.
Yeah.
It made me feel compassion for him. It made me feel bad for him in a lot of ways.
Sure.
It also inspired me, as it did you, to see someone so driven and so talented and so just never stopping. Yep. Just always like, I want to do this now. I'm going to see how I do with this. And I don't care what people say. And also still having the energy, that kind of, like, there's this one scene that was shot, I think just a couple years ago, where he's at his, mixing board or something. And I think it was during the Jesus is King or something, and people are singing, and he's kind of like leading with the beat, and his legs are really wide, and he's like dancing, he's just like, he's into it. And that kind of love for art and life and collective experience, I think, is inspirational.
Totally. Dude, that moment when, remember, it's toward the latter part, they're in the studio, and he's like, I need to make this feel more positive, and we need a melody. And he starts singing this little melody, and it's a great melody.
Yeah.
And then the producer, the guy he's working with, the engineer, he's like implementing it, and he's like, whoa, that really brought the song out. You could just tell, like, all that artistry is in there, and it was a really interesting moment, because I also, like, you hear him just singing the little melody he wants, and he's got really a great musical sense.
Yeah. And from
really
a wide variety of styles.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, the last thing I'll say is that there's a part that Cootie keeps in where, at the very end, that I think was just shot recently, where he is, there's all these little scenes throughout the documentary where he's riffing, he's rapping and riffing.
Yeah.
Freestyling, as they say. And it's, sometimes you're like, oh, that's when he wrote that song, or that's the beginning of that song that he wrote, or he altered that a little bit for that song, and then there are other moments where you're just like, wow, like, how it's almost better than, I kind of felt like some of his freestyling when he's just hanging out with his friends was better than his songs, like the energy, the way he has this, and a lot of rappers have this way of like building on the energy, right? And like they're always running down that field, that path. They're improvising, and there's always this risk that they're going to trip, but they never do. And you're just like, you're with them, and you're like, what's happening? And how he also plays with rhythm what I found also about Kanye is a very or I don't know how to say it, relatable rhythmic sense.
Oh, totally. That was the first thing I noticed back in the day when he came out. I was like, oh, this is interesting, because his rap style is simpler.
Right.
It sounds simpler. It's not actually that simple, and his phrases are really interesting, but it's more, like you said, more relatable in a sense.
It's more mainstream in that white people can probably sing along a little easier.
You say white people, but I actually think it's like maybe non-rap fans.
Yeah.
Because, for example, I love Eminem, and one of his greatest accomplishments is the song Rap God. Dude, that's a hard song to parse. He raps so much and so fast. I heard a stat, it's like, it's the song that hit the top charts with the most words in it ever.
Right. But Eminem also has a very, quote unquote, what I'm going to say, relatable rhythmic sense,
In the songs, I think the most popular songs that he did early on, especially like 8 Mile stuff, sure. But he plays...
No, throughout his... I mean, this is just opinion, but throughout his career, and it's no diss on him, but there are other rappers who it's sort of like the difference between like Kurt Cobain and a jazz like drummer, right? Because there are some rappers who are more like jazz drummers than they are like just kind of pop music. Anyway, point is that as Kanye is doing that throughout the documentary, it's you know, it's like, oh my God, it's inspirational. It's, you know, he's so good at that, and it really fills me with life as he's doing this stuff, and you can see people in the room like being filled with life. But then at the end, you see this scene where he starts to do that when he's on the plane, I believe, the private jet. And it's one of those moments where Cootie turns off the camera.
Yeah. Because
it kind of looks like he's becoming symptomatic. He's not making a lot of sense, and he's starting to rap kind of in an uncomfortable way.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
To see someone with so much promise and genius and ability,
right,
and to see it now kind of changing, I thought was really sad.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, well, as always, Berto, I thought it was going to be an hour long, but it's almost 3 hours.
Yeah.
And that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. If you're going to criticize Berto, he isn't reading anymore. So don't bother.
Bruno.
You
can criticize Bruno all you want.
Yeah. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself and don't talk about Bruno because
you deserve it.